Chapter 13. The Story of Prince Sincere. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. The Story of Prince Sincere. There was once upon a time in the country of Zinzolantines a king who had an extreme passion for silkworms. He spent whole days in his gardens gathering mulberry leaves for their nourishment. The remainder of his time he spent in his closet, watching those little animals at work, and making skeins of the silk they had spun, for he could find no one to do this to his satisfaction. In fact, no one could perform this office so well as his Majesty. He frequently made presents of his skeins to the lords of his court, most of them, of course, silkworm fanciers, as they, like all true courtiers, gloried in imitating their sovereign. Now what was the consequence of all this? Politeness and wit abandoned an abode where they were so slightly esteemed. Rudeness and folly seized upon the youth of the court, and weariness or ennui fell to the lot of its fairest ladies. Hopeless of having their charms and accomplishments appreciated by men who only understood and admired the beauty of silkworms and the fineness of their silk, nearly all the ladies retired into the distant provinces of the kingdom. In one of these there was formed a little court, not of princes, not of dukes, nor even of marquises, from neglect and rudeness, but of persons of a less elevated grade, who, possessing none of the above titles, were not the less worthy men on that account. At this little court were to be found refined tastes and virtuous principles. Its inhabitants cultivated the sciences, and enjoyed all reasonable pleasures without ever banishing that delicacy which constitutes their principal charm. In a word, they were in all things the exact reverse of those who composed the court of his silk-winding Majesty, from which the Queen was one of the first who retired. She had a very fine castle, situated in a forest near the seashore. This castle she chose for her residence, and having bade the king adieu, to whom her departure caused no great uneasiness, she set out, accompanied by the two princesses who were the sole fruits of her marriage with the king, and a few of her attendants, of whose zeal and affection she was assured. The solitude of the castle did not disgust her. She embellished it by tasteful improvements, and made it a charming abode by uniting within and about it some of the most beautiful objects of nature, and the most perfect productions of art. Surrounded by persons whom she loved, she enjoyed in this retirement a tranquil repose to which she had before been a stranger. The princesses also were delighted with their abode. They were fond of music, and among their train were several who cultivated that art with the most brilliant success. These two young ladies were equally beautiful in face as in figure, yet were they not equally amiable. The elder, whose name was Catherine, was proud, envious, revengeful, and cruel. The younger was gentle and affectionate, and her greatest pleasure was to oblige. In her heart and in her mind she had 1,000 charming qualities, which made her beloved by all who had the happiness to know her. She consequently deserved the characteristic name of Amy. She was affectionately attached to her sister, though she was not ignorant that she was disliked by her. One day, after enduring a torrent of reproaches from Catherine because she would not appear in an unsuitable dress at a masked ball at which a numerous assemblage was expected, Amy took a solitary walk by the seashore to dissipate the sorrow that her sister's ill humor had engendered. Catherine, filled with anger at her sister's non-compliance with her wishes, went also to walk in a neighboring forest, that she might devise a dress to appear in at the ball which should eclipse in brilliancy that of Amy. Filled with these thoughts, she had walked some distance from the castle without perceiving that she had gone much farther than she had intended. Weariness at length obliged her to seat herself at the foot of an old oak tree, whose foliage formed a shade impenetrable to the rays of the sun. Accidentally examining the immense size and thickness of the trunk of this oak, Catherine discovered a little key concealed between the bark and the wood. She took it in her hand, unable to divine what could be its use, and why it was there, and then endeavored to replace it. After trying to do so 2 or 3 times unsuccessfully, she pushed the key into a hole that she observed, when immediately the key turned round of itself. A little door flew open, which was sunk in the tree with infinite art, and the door being opened discovered a staircase. Catherine, curious to know where it could lead, determined to descend. The first steps were very obscure, but as she descended she noticed with surprise that the staircase was lighted by numerous waxen tapers placed in rock crystal lustres. The princess continued to descend, and having gone down more than 300 steps, she came to a magnificently furnished apartment. It will be said that it is astonishing and almost impossible that a young person of her sex should be sufficiently adventurous thus to enter alone into an unknown cavern. But I must inform my readers of a fact of which I possess undoubted evidence, which will cause their wonder to cease, namely, that Catherine wore on her little finger a ring that had been bequeathed to her by her grandfather on his deathbed, which would preserve her, until her 20th year, from every species of danger. Persuaded, therefore, that she had nothing to fear, she walked onward until she came to a large cabinet, or rather a storeroom, of rare jewels and precious stones. Catherine paused to examine the rarities she saw around her, when her eye, chancing to alight on a bed of cloth of silver standing in a kind of recess or grotto, what was her astonishment to observe, posing thereon, the handsomest young man she had ever beheld. He seemed to be buried in a profound sleep. Catherine approached to consider the sleeper more attentively. This curiosity cost her dearly, for from that moment she was no longer mistress of herself. Convinced, as all pretty women are, that no one could see her without loving her, she did not hesitate to awaken the charming unknown, with the hope of inspiring him with that tenderness which she already felt for him. Accordingly, she made a slight noise in passing into the next apartment, so that he might not think she had awakened him designedly. On entering this room, she found a written paper containing the following words: "She only, who shall be able to inspire the ugliest of mortals with the passion of love, can make an impression on the heart of the prince who reposes here." The Princess Catherine perused this paper several times, and flattered herself that her charms were quite powerful enough to affect the sleeper without her being obliged to seek out the ugliest of men in order to inspire him with a hopeless passion. Filled with this self-confidence, she was about to re-enter the cabinet, not doubting that she should find the unknown awake, when a spider's web, through which it was impossible to see any object distinctly, opposed her ingress directly she approached the door. "So slight an obstacle shall not prevent my entrance," said Catherine, and she endeavored to pass; but, notwithstanding all her efforts, she could not succeed in lifting or breaking through the web. Astonished to find such strength in so apparently slight a fabric, she resolved to reascend into the forest, to return to the queen, and have a search made for this ugliest of all ugly men, whom it was necessary to inspire with love ere she could hope to be beloved by the charming person she had just seen. Accordingly, she retraced her steps through all the apartments, ascended the staircase, passed out by the door in the tree, which was remaining open as she had left it; and no sooner was she in the open air than the door closed of itself so effectually that she could not observe exactly where it was, nor could she find the little key again. She walked several times round the oak with this view, but she could not succeed. Desperate at this last circumstance, she turned toward the castle, and as she was walking on the seashore, observed the Princess Amy, her sister, attentively examining a diamond of surprising size and beauty. A bird had just let it fall on her dress, telling her to keep it very carefully, as it would one day preserve her in a moment of great danger. Catherine, enchanted with the beauty of this admirable jewel, wished to have it in her possession, but attempting to snatch it from Amy, she was prevented by a little man from behind her, whose frightful appearance made both the princesses take flight and run for shelter into the forest. The little man was 3 feet high. His very large and flat head was thatched with lank red hair. His eyes were sunk in his head, and of such small dimensions that they would have been indistinguishable but for the bright red with which they were bordered. His nose was red and pointed. His cheeks hung as low as his breast, and his mouth and chin were graced by a long and bushy red beard. His ill-shapen body was supported by a single leg, on which it was balanced as on a pivot. But so nice was its equilibrium that the slightest breath of wind made it turn round continually, for which reason he went out in very calm weather only. He did not walk at all, but hopped with wonderful agility, and by many little hops he soon arrived wherever he wished to go. Catherine, recovered from the fear that the little monster had occasioned her, soon returned to him, and in an ill-humoured tone asked who he was, and what could have made him daring enough to oppose her desires. "I am a powerful king," answered the deformed, "and my name is Sincere. Reasons which I cannot disclose to you have banished me for a time from my dominions, and have obliged me to pass my time in the hollow of a rock, situated not very far from hence. I have seen you several times in this charming neighborhood. I have frequently noticed your unkind proceedings toward the princess, your sister, and I have only just prevented another injury you would have committed in taking from her a diamond, which is her property. My natural love of justice, joined to an impulse that I dare not declare, induced me to take your sister's part, and to prevent your doing her that wrong." Catherine heard the prince's long answer to her question with extreme impatience. However, she dissembled her anger, on reflecting that the speaker could not possibly be equaled for ugliness, and that consequently she ought to neglect nothing to please him, since it was written that on that condition only could she inspire a passion for herself in the person whom she now so dearly loved. Accordingly, assuming a more gentle air, she told Sincere that the rank of king and the unfortunate condition to which he appeared to be reduced compelled her to pardon him, that she even desired the honor of his friendship, which she flattered herself he would not refuse. She then invited him to the castle, assuring him that the queen, when she should learn of his quality, would doubtless offer him apartments in which he might tranquilly reside until fortune should cease to persecute him. The king politely thanked her, and told her that he was too well aware of his excessive ugliness to dare to flatter himself with the hope of obtaining the friendship of so beautiful a princess, or of residing at a court where he knew that the deformity of his figure could never be forgiven. Having expressed himself to this effect, the king made Catherine a bow and hopped away, sighing, and looking toward the amiable Amy, whom the presence of her sister had kept at a short distance during this conference. Amy had, however, overheard her sister's conversation with Sincere, and had been as much surprised at the affected kindness of the Princess Catherine as at her having invited him to the castle. She therefore reluctantly concluded that the princess had only assumed a show of mildness as a cloak to some wicked design. The pity that Amy felt for all who were unfortunate made her resolve immediately to warn the king that he should not place too much confidence in her sister's apparent friendship, and it was with some impatience she perceived that her engagements would compel her to defer until the morrow the execution of her project. But the next day, accompanied by a female attendant, Amy left the castle and took the road leading to Sincere's rock, at which she had nearly arrived when she heard some one singing a song, the words of which appeared to be addressed to herself. She stopped to listen. The tone of the voice she heard was so melodious, and so pleased her ear, that she remained riveted in the spot for some time after the song had ceased, until Cecily, her attendant, dispelled her reverie by informing her that Sincere was coming toward them. Although Amy had made up her mind to regard him without fear, she nevertheless found that she could not look upon him without trembling, and immediately turned away her face. Sincere appeared to observe her emotion with sorrow, but, saluting her very respectfully, he invited her to walk into his rustic palace to repose herself. Amy accepted his courtesy, telling his Majesty at the same time that she had come purposely to his grotto, that she might inform him of something of great importance. The king offered her his hand as gracefully as he could, and led her toward his grotto, entertaining her with the most lively conversation. The princess could never have imagined a person so ugly as Prince Sincere, with a mind so lively and penetrating. Everything he said, too, was pronounced in a tone that so charmed the princess that she could not help wishing over and over again that if ever she had a lover he might be possessed of the intelligence and graceful spirit of this unfortunate. At last she came to the rock which contained Sincere's grotto. It was carpeted with soft green moss. Within it was a table formed by a slab of white marble, of which nature had been the only artificer, while a bed and a few turf seats were the only furniture that Sincere's residence contained. A cascade of fresh and pure water fell from the height of the rock, and formed a small streamlet, whose gentle murmur, with the melodious songs of the nightingales perched among the branches of an orange tree laden with blossoms and fruit, sounded more charmingly in the princess's ears than the finest concert she had ever heard. After praising his pleasant retreat, Amy unfolded to Sincere her reasons for paying him this visit. The prince, charmed at the interest she took in what concerned himself, was very eloquent in the expressions of his gratitude. Some words even escaped him which made it sufficiently apparent that his heart was filled with the most tender love. Amy remarked them, but feigned not to understand that they were addressed to herself, and, by way of changing the subject of conversation, she informed the king with what satisfaction she had overheard a charming voice shortly before she saw him, and asked him if he were acquainted with the person who sang so well. "It is a prince who adores you," answered Sincere, "and who would make you an offer of his heart, his hand, and the crown that he will one day wear, but that his form forbids him to hope." Sincere sighed as he said these words. The princess blushed, and, not doubting that it was of himself he spoke, questioned him no further, and became very thoughtful. Shortly afterward she quitted the grotto, fearful that her absence might be noticed. She walked in the direction of the palace, observing to Cicely that she thought Sincere was a very intelligent man. "I protest, my dear Cicely," said she, "I feel for him, notwithstanding his deformity, what I never felt for any one before." "What, madam?" said the astonished attendant. "Is it possible that you can regard the little monster with any other feeling than horror? Nay, that you should even feel anything like affection for such a creature? Surely you could never resolve to live with him. What could you do with so hideous a being? The smallest wind makes him turn round like a weathercock." "Ah," said the young Princess Amy, "but then he thinks with such vivacity, and speaks with so much eloquence, that I should prefer him to the handsomest man in the world. Handsome men are nearly always wretchedly stupid, and too much in love with themselves. They pay greater devotion to their looking-glasses than to our sex." The princess would have continued, but at that moment she heard a cry that stopped her, and looking on the ground she saw with much surprise a white viper darting fire from its eyes, which spoke to her as follows: "Madame, you were about to crush me beneath your feet. If I were not so forgiving as I am, I should punish you for your thoughtlessness, but I pardon you on condition that you place me on the trunk of the large chestnut tree near you, from the branches of which I have just fallen. One of these days I shall acknowledge the service, for I am a fairy, though in common with all my sisters I am obliged to quit my natural shape one day in every week, and assume that form which may be ordained by an old sorcerer from whom we derive our power, and who punishes us in this way for having, one day while he slept, cut off his beard and mustachios, which were extremely displeasing objects. This evening I shall resume my usual form, and you will hear from me." Amy took the viper tremblingly in her hand, when it had ceased to speak, placed it on the tree, and hastily left the spot, unwilling to look again on an animal that had caused her so much fear. She then made the best of her way to the castle, where, on arriving, she learned that Catherine had just dispatched a courier with a message from the queen inviting King Sincere to come and spend a few days at the palace. This at first alarmed Amy, who was acquainted with her sister's wickedness, but her uneasiness was soon dissipated, for one of Catherine's attendants, to whom that princess had confided her adventure, informed her of what had taken place in the forest. Sincere was, as you may suppose, surprised at the queen's invitation. His first impulse was courteously to refuse it, but on reflecting that, by accepting it, he would be enabled to see the beautiful princess with whom he was in love every day, he resolved to set out, and hopped into a little calash that had been sent for his accommodation. His arrival was awaited at the castle with great impatience, arising, however, from widely different motives, the ladies of the court being curious to see a man who was unlike all other men, Catherine anxious to make a conquest of him for the sake of gaining the sleeper, and Amy looking for his arrival in the hope of enabling the wretched man to pass at least some days agreeably. At last he arrived, and was received with all the honors due to his rank. Catherine, who welcomed him very benignantly, was magnificently dressed, and looked so well that but for her sister she might have been pronounced the most beautiful woman in the universe. She was therefore much mortified to observe that, in spite of all her blandishments, Sincere was insensible to her charms, and that his regards were constantly directed toward Amy. Her anger was boundless to think that, having done all in her power to please the ugliest man in the world, she was yet unable to succeed. Whatever offends the self-love of the ladies is never forgiven. Accordingly, she became infuriated against the prince and her sister. What would she not have given to have prevented their seeing each other? However, that was impossible, for the king, being at liberty to speak to Amy, availed himself of every opportunity of so doing. While it was obvious that Amy was no unwilling auditor, and could not deny herself the pleasure of listening to Sincere. As the Princess Amy was one evening walking in an avenue in the park, she observed a ball rolling toward her very quickly. It stopped directly it was within a yard or two of her, and opening of itself, there issued from it a little woman, who continued to increase in size until she was 10 or 12 feet high. "I am the Fairy Severe," said she, addressing Amy, "whom you were kind enough to assist a few days ago." Amy recognized her, for the fairy darted fire from her eyes, as did the white viper she had placed upon the tree, and accordingly she saluted her very respectfully. Severe proceeded to inform Amy that the friendship she felt for that princess had induced her to demand her hand in marriage of the queen for the King of the Butterflies, her nephew, who was the most amiable man in the world. "I have just left the queen's closet," concluded the fairy, "and I have obtained your mother's consent. His Majesty will arrive here in 2 or 3 days to make you his queen." This information, which would have afforded much pleasure to many princesses, sensibly afflicted the young Amy. She was so much grieved at hearing it, that she was unable to utter a word in answer to the fairy. Severe, imagining that joy prevented her speaking, kissed her forehead. Then, bidding her adieu, she re-entered her ball, which returned in the direction it had come. At this moment Cicely brought the princess word that the queen wished to speak with her. Accordingly she hastened to her mother, who, without giving her time to speak, ordered her to prepare herself to receive the King of the Butterflies as her husband at the end of 2 days. Amy threw herself at her mother's feet, and conjured her to recall the promise she had made to Severe. The queen, however, was inflexible. She dreaded the power of the fairies, and hopeful that Severe would one day confer on her some mark of her friendship, she told her daughter that she would be obeyed. Amy dared not reply, and retired in deep affliction. Catherine, who at any other time would have been jealous of the fairy's preference for her sister, was delighted at the intended match, flattering herself that when Sincere no longer saw Amy, he must fall in love with herself. This sorrowful news was not long in reaching the ears of that unfortunate king, and it affected him to such a degree that he fell dangerously ill. Meanwhile, the day arrived on which the fairy's nephew was to be presented. The queen, the princesses, and all the court went out to receive him. and had no sooner reached the terrace than they perceived afar off a very brilliant-looking kind of cloud, which was rapidly approaching the castle. It immediately struck them that this must be the prince, and the conjecture proved to be well founded. The King of the Butterflies was coming, seated in a diamond chariot, drawn by upward of 10,000 butterflies, all of a delicate rose color. They were harnessed to the chariot by traces of fine gold thread, interwoven with consummate skill. 100 young lords followed their master in calashes of rock crystal, set with emeralds and rubies, drawn likewise by butterflies, but the latter were quite white. When the king's chariot arrived near the place where the ladies were standing, his majesty alighted in their presence, his suite attending him in admirable order. He was richly dressed, and never was dandy more powdered or better curled than his majesty. He must have passed at least 3 hours at his toilet, and his dread of disarranging his curls made him walk very gently. However, this did not prevent his appearing to great advantage, and everybody admired him, the ladies making observations to each other as to the delicate whiteness of his complexion and hands. Nothing could exceed the symmetry of his shape, with which, indeed, he himself seemed to be not a little enamored. He easily recognized the Princess Amy by a portrait which had been given to him by the fairy, and having approached that young lady, he made her a very formal bow, and presenting his arm, said to her, "This is not a proper place, charming Amy, to compliment you on your beauty. The air is too sultry. Is it possible to converse at one's ease on a terrace, exposed to the melting rays of the sun? Therefore, let us enter the palace, and not risk our being turned black as Ethiopians." And almost without saluting the queen and the ladies of her suite, the King of the Butterflies turned toward the castle. Having entered, with the Princess Amy and those who accompanied her, into a large saloon which had been prepared for his reception, he threw himself on a sofa, observing that he was stifled with heat, and then he lolled at full length in a position anything but graceful. However, he was polite enough to ask the princess's pardon for his apparent disrespect, assuring her that he was in absolute want of repose, and that he must be a little cooler before he could resolve to speak to her on the important subject of his coming. Thereupon he drew sundry diamond-smelling and essence bottles from his pocket, and poured some perfume on his hands. Then, pulling out 2 or 3 jeweled gold boxes, he took snuff, and commenced humming a little air, which having concluded, he asked Amy whether she did not think his equipage was very splendid, and whether his dress, which he had selected from among 200, was to her taste, finishing by relating to her the history of the numberless ladies who were dying of love for him. It is easy to judge whether such topics were gratifying to the fair Amy, she who preferred wit and good sense to every charm of person, and who was quite different from the generality of her sex, on whom a magnificent suit of clothes, a dashing figure, and a few other equally worthless attractions make more impression than an amiable heart and an enlightened understanding. Accordingly, she conceived so great an aversion for the King of the Butterflies that she was obliged to quit the saloon, stating that she was unwell, and retire to her apartment, there to conceal her sorrow and her tears. Although Sincere was unwell, on hearing of Amy's illness he contrived to drag himself to her apartment to inquire after her health. When the Princess Amy saw him, she sighed and said, "Ah, Prince, why has not the Queen destined me to be yours? Are you unable to snatch me from him to whom they would by force unite me?" Sincere, enraptured, seized her hand, and kissing it tenderly, said, "What, beautiful Amy, is it possible that you would rather live with me than with a prince whose handsome face, person, and manners are universally admired? Deformed as I am, can I be so fortunate as not to be hateful to your sight? In mercy, answer me. Your reply will decide on the happiness or misery of my life." "Yes, sir," said the charming Amy, "know that I love you." This confession, she would have spoken further, but Sincere, hopping backward, became gradually smaller and smaller, until at last he was quite invisible. A heavy cloud of smoke then appeared where he had lately stood, which slowly clearing away, the princess discovered an extremely handsome young man, whose looks, at once majestic, benignant, and intelligent, inspired her with a certain indescribable emotion, which engaged her heart in his favor the moment their eyes met. The Princess Amy continued for some time to regard him with equal admiration and surprise, but her astonishment increased tenfold when the stranger addressed to her, in the most respectful manner, the following words: "The charming avowal you have just made, madam, has forever ended my enchantment. I am the Prince Sincere, who, under my former wretched form, was rash enough to tell you he adored you." Amy recognized him by the tone of his voice, and giving vent to her joy at finding him so different from what he had hitherto appeared, she entreated Sincere to inform her how such a strange metamorphosis had been brought about. "I am the sovereign," answered the prince, "of the island of Sincerity, and when the event I am about to relate to you happened, I was reigning over that island very peaceably, beloved by all my subjects. One day, at the chase, as I was very eagerly pursuing a lion which had escaped me several times, I unconsciously lost my way. I found myself in a shady walk, when, on looking around me, I observed a woman shaped exactly, madam, as you have always hitherto seen me. I gazed on her in astonishment, and I could not forbear laughing to see her turn round on her single leg like a weathercock. She perceived my mirth, and in an angry voice asked what amused me. Politeness forbade my telling her, but she pressed me so closely that I at last confessed that her singular figure had provoked my laughter. My candor displeased her. She knit her brows, and after throwing 2 or 3 somersaults in the air, said, "As a punishment for your insolence, I ordain that your form shall become similar to mine, and no power shall restore your proper shape until you meet with a young princess, in whom are united wit, good nature, and beauty, for whom you shall feel a violent love, and who, notwithstanding your deformity, shall be inspired with sufficient passion for yourself to make you, unasked, an avowal of her tenderness. You will, however, resume your natural form during the space of 1 hour every day, but it shall only take place in a certain cavern situated in a forest in the dominions of the silkworm Fancying King. I ordain further that you shall not be permitted to apprise any person whatever of your misfortune until your enchantment shall be dispelled." I listened very patiently to this threatening speech, believing that it would not be followed by any effects. But what was my grief when, after this frightful fairy, for fairy she was, had breathed on me, I became as misshapen as herself. My transformation completed, she hopped away laughing with all her might. I dared not return to my palace and state what had occurred, persuaded that I should neither be recognized nor believed. The desire I felt to recover my original form prompted me to travel through many kingdoms and visit many courts, in hopes of finding such a princess as the fairy had mentioned, but my travels were attended by no result. I consequently grew tired of searching, and formed the resolution of leading a solitary life in some retired nook, far removed from the habitations of my fellow men. I made choice of the rock where you visited me, and I had resided there about a year when I had the happiness of seeing you for the first time. You appeared to me a divinity. I felt that you were the only person who could inspire me with love, though I dared not hope to inspire you with that passion in return. Nor could I even think it possible that you could endure to look upon me. I went occasionally to the cavern in the forest, to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing myself for a few minutes in my natural form, as you now see me. One day I was surprised at being visited there by the princess your sister, for a talisman opposed the entrance of all mortals into the cavern. I feigned to be asleep that I might avoid speaking to her, and because I felt that the moment of my restoration to my horrible shape was drawing near, and it took place the moment your sister went into the next apartment. I quitted the cavern by an avenue unknown to all save myself. Catherine, however, left it also in the same manner, for it was impossible for her to re-enter the apartment in which she had seen me. She completed her 20th year while she was in the cavern, and her ring had virtue against talismans until she had attained that age only. There, dearest Amy, is the history of my metamorphosis. It now only remains for me to declare my lasting passion for you, and to entreat you to allow me to solicit your hand of the Queen, your mother, and her Majesty's permission for you to reign over my dominions, where you will find everybody zealous to obtain your favor." As Sincere ceased to speak, Catherine and Severe, who had overheard the whole of his discourse with Amy, entered the room. Both of them were in transports of rage. The fairy because Amy preferred another to her nephew, and Catherine because Sincere, in whom she recognized the charming young man she had seen in the cavern, was in love with her sister. She gave vent to her incensed feelings against the two lovers in a torrent of abusive language, but Severe terminated the dispute by seizing the unfortunate Amy by her flowing ringlets and dragging her through the open window, while the king, in despair, was unable to offer the slightest opposition. The miserable Sincere immediately rushed out of the palace, in spite of Catherine, who would have detained him, and without knowing whither he went, he hastened onward, resolved to take no repose until he should have recovered his dear princess. The King of the Butterflies, on being informed of what had transpired, laughed heartily. He thought it a very good joke, and returned to his kingdom. Meanwhile his good aunt dragged Amy along at immense speed, and after scaling many steep rocks and traversing many wide deserts, arrived at the base of an old tower. The door opened at her bidding, and she entered, pulling the princess after her. Severe made Amy follow her into a large hall full of snails, and told her in a shrill voice that if she would not consent to marry the King of the Butterflies, she must in the space of 8 days teach all these snails to dance or become herself a snail. Having made this threat, Severe flew away, and the princess gave way to a violent burst of tears, without feeling the slightest inclination to obey her. Let us leave her to weep over her seemingly hopeless task for the present, and return to King Sincere. That prince, having passed through several kingdoms, came at last to a thick forest. On walking a short distance into this forest, he perceived a house built entirely of leaves, the door of which standing open, he saw an old woman seated in an armchair, reading aloud to 3 little children. He passed the house without stopping, or taking any notice of it, and was proceeding on his way, when the old woman called after him, crying in a cracked voice, and shaking her head, "Prince, you are searching in vain. You will never meet with the Princess Amy until you shall have first found a brilliant frog, an extremely ugly woman, who is conscious of her want of beauty, and does not attempt to make conquests, and a witless man who does not flatter himself that he is clever." King Sincere rightly judged from these words that the speaker was a fairy, so he entreated her to grant him some other and less difficult means of recovering his charming Amy. But she only answered him by grimaces, and burst into a loud fit of laughter. The disconsolate prince was consequently obliged to proceed onward, though he was extremely fatigued, and very much afflicted, and quite unconscious as to the road he was taking. He met another old woman, who asked him what occasioned his grief. Sincere informed her of his misfortunes, not omitting what the fairy he had just left had said to him, and adding that he could not flatter himself with the hope of ever seeing his beloved Amy again, if it were indeed true that happiness depended on his finding a brilliant frog. "This," said he, "appears to me to be utterly ridiculous even to seek. The 2 other conditions would cause me less uneasiness." "Do not flatter yourself," said the good woman. "They are, at least, equally difficult to accomplish. However, by diligent searching you may meet with all 3 of the required curiosities. But if at the expiration of a year from this time you shall not have discovered them,
Take my advice, and trouble yourself no further, for your case will be hopeless. Go, I may not tell you more, but do not let my sister, whom you have just quitted, see you again in this vicinity. She is wicked, and you might experience some treachery at her hands. She has only informed you of the conditions on which you are permitted to withdraw your princess from her place of confinement, because she is persuaded that you can never fulfill them."
The king, who had some reason to dread enchantments, hastened away as fast as he could, and travelled through every kingdom in the world on a horse which he most fortunately found on quitting the wood. In every city, town, village, hamlet, and castle that he came to, he made an indefatigable search for the ugly old women and stupid men. He found abundance of both, but remarked that none of the ladies were offended with their truth-telling mirrors at the reflection of their ugliness, nay, that they all conceived it to be quite easy to render themselves still attractive by a slight and judicious use of the most renowned cosmetics. Some whom he saw painted an inch thick at least. Others were sundry patches very artfully disposed, and all decorated themselves with flowers and ribbons enough to stock a milliner's magazine, and flattered themselves that, in spite of time, they were still very amiable, and that they might dispute the palm of beauty with the fairest and the youngest. This common effect of self-love on the sex did not surprise the prince. He knew that all ladies are endowed from their birth with a tolerably good opinion of themselves, but what did indeed astonish him was that he found among the men the same self-love equally strong, and with such an addition of little weaknesses as would even make the fair sex itself contemptible. He had always heard that man was the most perfect of nature's work, and he, being a man, had given faith to the aphorism without examining it too closely. But his opinion on this subject was strangely altered by the opportunities which his travels afforded him to study this creature of perfection more attentively. He now observed that the minds of most men were occupied by trifles, that many spent their time wholly at the toilet, at table, at play, or what is worse, in professing passion where they felt none; that others assembled in society, not to reason with sense and propriety, but to repeat all the nonsense they had heard elsewhere, to exchange bon mots current in every jest-book, and to make a display of the valuable rings, jewels, and all the finery which their ill-spent incomes placed within their reach. He met with some more senseless still, who, fancying themselves extremely clever, were continually arguing without understanding what they talked about, or perceiving that they made all who were patient enough to listen to them yawn with fatigue. With others, who were sanguine enough to hope that they were making themselves agreeable by repeating bad stories that they had already thrust upon their auditors upward of 100 times, while others again, who, not letting a word fall from their lips because they actually knew not what to say, imagined that their silence would be esteemed as a mark of wisdom. I should never conclude were I to mention all the different kinds of fools Sincere met with in his travels. Yet could he not among them all find one such as he sought, for there was not one of them who did not think he had wit. In search of the man, the woman, and the frog, he had twice travelled round the world, but each time unsuccessfully, when, beginning to lose all hope of ever finding them, he remembered what the good old woman had told him, and thought that he ought now to renounce life, since life no longer had charms for him. While absorbed in these reflections, he found himself on the banks of a river. The sight of the water offered too favorable an opportunity for self-destruction to pass unnoticed. Accordingly, he plunged into the stream, resolved at once to put a period to an existence that his misfortunes had rendered insupportable. Instead of drowning, however, as he wished and expected, he felt himself gently sinking beneath the waters, and almost immediately alighted on a flowery turf in the middle of a fine garden. At first Sincere thought he must be dreaming, but on assuring himself that he was not asleep, he arose and looked around him. in order to discover the inhabitants of these subaqueous regions. The prince walked about for some time in this solitary place. At last he heard the sound of horns and dogs, and in a moment afterward the huntsman burst upon his sight. Never was surprise equal to Sincere's. The huntsmen were so many immense frogs, mounted on large green cats, and they were in chase of a hare. Some of them were dressed in the costumes of Amazons, others wore taffeta gowns and little caps on their heads decked with flowers and feathers. Several of them were sounding horns, while others were hallooing to the dogs. In a word, the sight was at once beautiful and unique. They desisted from hunting on seeing Sincere, and alighted from their cats to meet him, walking upright on their 2 hind legs, and using their 2 others as we use our arms. When the troop arrived near the prince, she who appeared to be the mistress of the rest very gracefully saluted him. She wore a long purple gown embroidered with pearls and diamonds, and bore on her forehead so brilliant a mark that the eyes of Sincere could not bear to look on it. "You are welcome, sir," said she, "and your arrival has long been expected. We are all enchanted, and you alone can dissolve the charm. I have not been always in the condition you see me. I formerly reigned over this kingdom, and the frogs you see around me were my subjects. I had so violent an aversion to animals of the frog kind that I gave orders for all found in my kingdom to be put to death. Nothing was neglected that could contribute to the extirpation of these objects of my dislike. But notwithstanding, as I was taking a walk one evening, I discovered one almost under my chamber window. I immediately called my attendants, and gave orders for it to be killed. But the frog had disappeared, and had so effectually concealed itself that after the most diligent search it could not be found. I was walking the next day near the same spot, when a very ugly black woman appeared before me. In one hand she held a hazel wand, and in the other a vial full of oil, which having poured on my head, she said, "I am the fairy Granuletta, and the person whom you yesterday so kindly desired to be put to death. Indeed, your orders have exposed me to death 100 times, but the hour of my vengeance is arrived. Become a frog in your turn, you and all your subjects who have so blindly obeyed you. I ordain that you shall remain under that shape, until a king who shall stand in need of your assistance shall in return restore you to your proper form." Hardly had the fairy pronounced these words, when I was transformed into the creature you see. I applied immediately to a fairy who protected me, but she was not permitted to disenchant me. She described to me, however, the person who alone had power to do so, and told me that he had a white hair in his left eyebrow, bestowed on him by a skillful magician at the moment of his birth, and which enabled him to dispel all enchantments. This fairy has conducted you hither, and it was she who, under the form of a bird, made the Princess Amy a present of the superb diamond. And lastly, she it was who took care to place this brilliant mark on my forehead, and who will enable you to find a witless man who is aware of his stupidity, and a woman who is conscious that her ugliness is insupportable. These 2 extraordinary persons she has brought hither, fearful that the self-love which reigns in the world should corrupt them, as it has corrupted every one else, and thus destroy your hopes. You will find them in a little cabin at a short distance from this spot. But, Prince, before you visit them, pray have the kindness to restore to us our natural shapes, and allow us to pull from your eyebrow the famous hair to whose virtue we shall owe our restoration, as it will be equally necessary to enable you to effect the deliverance of your princess." Sincere wanted no more entreating, but suffered the hair to be pulled from his eyebrow. He took it from the frog, and touching her and all those around her therewith, they were immediately changed into princes and princesses, very good-looking and very amiable. The queen and her subjects were sufficiently eloquent in their thanks to King Sincere for his kindness. At the moment the transformation took place, the second old woman that the prince had seen in the wood appeared, and told Sincere that, as a recompense for the service he had just done her friend, She would, after he had visited the foolish man and the ugly woman, who would give him an herb that he would presently have occasion for, transport him to the place where his beautiful Amy was confined. Accordingly, Sincere paid a hasty visit to this singular pair, found them to be such as he was in search of, and received from them the mysterious herb. The kind fairy then took an apple, which she changed into a very pretty carriage. It traveled without horses at the rate of 300 miles a minute, and is supposed to have been the first swift carriage invented. She seated herself therein, and placed the prince by her side. Sincere was charmed with this wonderful vehicle, but never will carriage be made to travel fast enough for a lover impatient to rejoin his mistress. Nevertheless, they arrived in an incredibly short space of time at the base of the tower in which the beautiful Amy was confined, weeping over tasks impossible to perform, and which the fairy Severe had assigned her, to afford herself a pretext for tormenting the lovely princess. We left Amy in her prison, weeping over the apparently hopeless task of teaching a quantity of snails to dance, and we are now going to inform those who feel any curiosity to learn how the princess performed that difficult exploit. From the first 7 days she wept unceasingly, and gave herself no trouble about the instruction of the scholars that had been placed under her charge. But on the 8th day, which was that on which the fairy was expected to return for the purpose of changing her into a snail, should she not have succeeded, her grief was redoubled to think of the time she had thrown away. However, she determined immediately to give the awkward animals some lessons, but soon saw that all her instructions were useless. Persuaded that her fate was inevitable, she thought seriously of putting an end to her existence, for she preferred death to becoming a snail or marrying the king of the butterflies. With these thoughts in her mind, the miserable Amy threw open the window with the intention of precipitating herself from it. But, fortunately, recalling to her recollection at that moment the ring she had received from a bird, and the words that accompanied the gift, she drew it from her pocket, and regarding it attentively, "Beautiful, brilliant," said she, "if you have the power to rescue me from the danger I am in, I entreat you to put a period to my misfortunes." Directly the Princess Amy had pronounced these words, the ring opened, and there issued from it a string of little dancing masters and violin players. The latter immediately commenced playing, while the dancing masters arranged the snails in sets, and taught them in an instant every kind of dance. Then all the musicians and the masters disappeared. This marvelous occurrence greatly comforted the princess. She wiped away her tears, kissed her ring in a transport of joyful gratitude, and concealed it more carefully than she had previously done, fearful that Severe should learn its value and take it from her. Hardly had the princess placed her ring securely in her bosom, when the wicked fairy arrived, and asked her, with a malignant smile, if her scholars were proficient in the art of dancing. "You shall see, madam," said Amy, in a mild and timid voice. Then, opening the door of the hall that contained them, the princess began to sing. On hearing her voice, all the little animals began to dance, and that so prettily, especially the waltz, gallopade, and saraband, that Severe became at once surprised and furious. The poor princess having succeeded so well in this, the merciless fairy gave her other and still more difficult tasks, but Amy performed them all with the assistance of her ring. Her repeated successes so enraged the fairy against her that she shut Amy in a large iron cage, placed her in a yard full of wild and ravenous beasts, and stationed 2 terrible dragons to guard the door, who made frightful efforts to break open the cage and devour the princess. The unfortunate princess had been thus confined about a month when she saw Sincere enter the yard. He had easily obtained admission by touching the door with his herb. Amy shuddered at the danger to which her lover was exposed. Directly Sincere saw his mistress in that cruel situation, he put his hand on his sword with the intention of slaying the 2 dragons. I say put his hand, because ere he had time to draw it, the good fairy who had conducted him thither desired him to hold, and to touch them only with the herb which he held in his left hand. Sincere did so, when the dragons immediately fell dead at his feet. And touching the door of the cage with the charmed hair of his eyebrow, he instantaneously felt himself, the princess, and the kind fairy ascend into the air surrounded by a fleecy cloud, which speedily conveyed the trio to the island of Sincerity. The king was immediately recognized by his subjects, who testified such joy at their sovereign's return as showed how severely they must have felt his loss, and how dear he was to them. For his part, in ecstasy at finding himself again with his beloved, he said to her the most passionate things, to which Amy replied with a tenderness quite equal to his own. Sincere instantly dispatched ambassadors to the court of the silkworm-fancying king, to demand the princess in marriage. The ambassadors were not long in executing their commission. On their return they brought intelligence that his silkworm-fancying majesty had blown his brains out with a pistol, about 12 months before, in consequence of being unable to wind an exceedingly entangled skein of silk; that the queen had died 6 months afterward of the smallpox, and that Catherine had poisoned herself on the day of Sincere's departure in search of his mistress. The Princess Amy was very much afflicted on hearing this sorrowful news, and immediately went into mourning for her parents and sister, which she wore for 6 months. At the expiration of that time she married King Sincere, and they lived together for a long series of years, without experiencing the slightest misfortune, or ceasing to love each other as tenderly as on the day of their wedding. The beneficent fairy then set out from their court to rejoin Queen Brilliant, her friend, and the hair of the king's eyebrow, which had been to them of such assistance, was set in a golden ring, which Sincere wore ever afterward on the third finger of his left hand, to preserve him from the malice of fairies. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Princess Rosetta. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lewis, Houston, Texas. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. Princess Rosetta. There was once upon a time a king and queen who had 2 fine boys. As they grew to boyhood they became beautiful as the day. So well were they nurtured that they looked older than they were. The queen never failed to invite the fairies at the birth of her children, and she always begged her visitors to tell her what would happen to them. After a while she had a beautiful little girl, who was so pretty that it was impossible to see her without loving her. Again she invited the fairies, and they came in great state, the chief fairy in a sledge drawn by reindeer, for her home was in the far north. The queen, having regaled all the fairies who came to see her on the occasion, said to them, as they were about to leave, "Do not forget your usual custom, but tell me what will happen to Rosetta," which was the little princess's name. The fairies told her that they had left their conjuring book at home, and that they would come to see her again another time. "Ah," said the queen, "that forebodes no good. You do not wish to afflict me by an unhappy prediction. I pray you, however, to conceal nothing from me, but tell me all." They tried hard to excuse themselves, but this only made the queen more anxious to know her daughter's destiny. At last the chief fairy said to her, "We fear, madam, that Rosetta will bring a severe misfortune upon her brothers, that they will even be put to death on her account. This is all we can foretell of this beautiful little girl, and we are very sorry that we have not better news to give you." They then left her, and the queen remained so sorrowful that the king noticed it. He asked her what was the matter. She replied that she had gone too near the fire, and had burned all the flax off her distaff. "Is that all?" said the king. He went to his stores and bought her more flax than she could have spun in 100 years. The queen was still sad, and the king asked her again what was the matter. She told him that she was walking by the river he had let one of her green satin slippers fall therein. "Is that all?" said the king. He immediately summoned all the shoemakers in his kingdom, and gave the queen 10,000 slippers made of the same material. Still the queen was not consoled, and the king asked her a third time what was the matter. She said that she was eating too fast. She had swallowed her wedding ring. The king knew that she was not telling him the truth, for he had the ring about him. So he said to her, "My dear, you are telling a falsehood. Here is your ring, which I had in my purse." The lady, as may be supposed, was vexed to be caught telling an untruth, for it is the most wicked thing in the world, and she saw that the king was angry. So she told him what the fairies had predicted of the little Rosetta, adding that if he knew any means of preventing it, he must tell her. The king, much grieved at this, replied, "My dear, I know of no other means of saving our two sons' lives than putting Rosetta to death while she is yet in her cradle." The queen, however, said that she would rather suffer death herself than to consent to so cruel an action, and begged her husband to think of some other remedy. While the king and queen were still thinking on this subject, the queen was told that there was, in a large wood near the town, an old hermit, who lived in a lonely cell, and that he was consulted by people far and near. She said, "I must go then and consult him also, as the fairies have told me the evil, but they have forgotten to tell me the remedy." So the next morning she rose early, mounted a pretty little white mule, whose shoes were of gold, and left the palace, accompanied by two of her young ladies, who each rode on a nice horse also. When they were near the wood, the queen and her young ladies alighted, and sought the cell where the hermit lived. He did not like to see the women, but when he perceived that it was the queen, he said to her, "You are welcome. What do you want with me?" She told him what the fairies had said of Rosetta, and asked his advice. He directed her to shut the princess in a tower, and never allow her to leave it. The queen thanked him, rewarded him liberally, and went back to tell the king. The king, having heard this, caused a large tower to be erected, and when it was finished, confined his daughter therein. But that she might not be lonely, he and the queen and the two young princesses visited her every day. The eldest was called Prince Royal, and the youngest Prince Orlando. They both loved their sister passionately, for she was the fairest and the sweetest tempered girl that was ever seen. Her slightest glance was worth more than 100 crowns. When she was 15 years old, the Prince Royal said to the king, "Surely, father, my sister is old enough to be married. Shall we not soon celebrate her wedding?" Prince Orlando put the same question to the queen, but their majesties amused them without replying directly on the subject of marriage. At last the king and queen were taken very ill, and died nearly the same day. Everybody was very sorrowful, and went into mourning. The bells were also tolled throughout the kingdom. Rosetta was inconsolable at the death of her kind mother. When the king and the queen were buried, the noblemen of the kingdom placed the Prince Royal on a golden throne set with diamonds, put a handsome crown on his head, dressed him in violet-colored velvet clothes, spangled with suns and moons, and then all the court cried 3 times, "Long live the king!" Nothing was thought of but rejoicing. The king and the prince said to one another, "Now that we are the masters, we shall surely liberate our sister from the tower, where she has been so long and is so melancholy." To reach the tower they had only to cross the garden, in a corner of which it was built, very high indeed, for the deceased king and queen had intended for her to reside there all her life. Rosetta was embroidering a fine gown on a frame which stood before her, but when she saw her brothers she rose, and taking the king's hand said, "Good morrow, sire. Now that you are king, and I am your little servant, I entreat you to remove me from this tower, where I am very, very solitary." She then began to cry. The king embraced her and told her to dry her tears, for he had come to take her to a fine castle. The prince, who had his pockets full of sweetmeats, gave them to Rosetta and said to her, "Come, let us quit this ugly tower. The king will soon find a husband for you, so do not afflict yourself." When Rosetta saw the nice garden full of flowers, fruits, and fountains, she was so surprised that she could not say a word, for she had, till then, never seen anything of the kind. She looked all round, walked a little way, stopped, and then gathered fruit from the trees and the flowers from the parterre. Her little dog, Fretillon, who was green like a parrot, had only one ear, and who danced to admiration, ran before her, barking, "Bow, wow, wow," with 1,000 leaps and capers. Fretillon very much amused the company, but all at once he ran into a little wood. The princess followed him, and never was anyone more surprised than she was at seeing in this wood a large peacock, which, with its tail spread out, appeared to her so beautiful that she could not take her eyes off of it. The king and the prince, who soon came up with her, asked her at what she was so amazed. She shewed them with the peacock and asked them what it was. They told her that it was a bird of a kind that was sometimes eaten. "What!" said she, "do they ever kill and eat so beautiful a bird? I declare to you that I will marry no one but the king of the peacocks. I shall then be queen, and I will take care that no peacocks are eaten." It would be impossible to express the king's astonishment. "But, sister," said he to her, "where shall we find the king of the peacocks?" "Wherever you please, sire," said she, "but I will marry no one but him." After she had taken this resolution, the two princesses led her to their castle, where they were obliged to take the peacock also, and put it in her room, for she was very fond of it. All the ladies who had not seen Rosetta hastened to seek an introduction, to pay their court to her. Some brought her sweetmeats, some sugar plums, others rich gowns, fine ribbons, dolls, embroidered shoes, pearls, and diamonds. She was feasted everywhere, and she was so well behaved and civil, kissing her hand and curtsying whenever anything was given her, that everyone was pleased with her. While she was discoursing with her company, the king and the prince were considering how they should find the king of the peacocks, if there were one in the world. They came to the determination of having a portrait taken of the Princess Rosetta, and they had it done so beautifully that it only wanted speech. "Since you will only marry the king of the peacocks, we are about to seek him for you all over the earth. We shall be very glad to find him, and you must take care of our kingdom during our absence." Rosetta thanked them for the pains they were taking, told them that she would govern the kingdom well, and that while they were gone her only pleasures would be looking at the beautiful peacock and seeing Fretillon dance. They could not help crying when they bade one another adieu. Behold the two young princesses on their journey, asking everyone they met, "Pray, do you know the king of the peacocks?" They were always answered, "No, gentlemen, no." They still kept going forward, until at last they got so far that no one had ever seen so far before. They presently arrived at the kingdom of the mayflies. There is no longer such a place to be seen. The mayflies made such a loud humming that the king was afraid he should lose his hearing. He asked the one who appeared to him to be the most intelligent looking among them, whether he knew where the king of peacocks was to be found. "Sire," said the mayfly, "his kingdom is 90,000 miles from here. You have taken the longest road to reach it." "How do you know that?" said the king. "Because," said the mayfly, "we go every year to pass 2 or 3 months in their gardens." Then the king and his brother embraced the mayfly again and again. They became very friendly and dined together. The princes examined with admiration all the curiosities of their country, where the smallest leaf was worth $1. They afterward departed to finish their journey, and, as they now knew the road were not long before they completed it. They observed that all the trees were loaded with peacocks. The place was so full of them that their voices might be heard 6 miles off. The king said to his brother, "If the king of the peacocks is a peacock himself, how will our sister be able to marry him? We should be foolish, too, to consent to the match. What a splendid alliance would she form for us, little peacocks for nephews and nieces!" The prince was equally grieved. "It is an unfortunate fancy that occupies her mind," said he. "I cannot think where she learned that there was a king of the peacocks." When they arrived at the chief town they observed that it was full of men and women, whose clothes were made of peacock feathers, and that peacock feathers were displayed everywhere as very fine things. They met the king, who was taking an airing in a beautiful little carriage, made of gold and set with diamonds, drawn by 12 peacocks, which were harnessed to it. The king of the peacocks was so very handsome that our king and the prince were charmed with him. He was fair complexioned, had long, light-colored curly hair, and a crown of large peacock feathers. When he came up, he conjectured that the 2 princes, as they were dressed differently from the people of the country, were foreigners, and in order to ascertain he stopped his carriage and called to them. The king and the prince went up to him, and having made an obeisance, said, "Sire, we have come from afar to show you a portrait." They then took from the portmanteau the large picture of Rosetta. When the king of the peacocks had looked at it, "I cannot imagine," said he, "that there is in the world so beautiful a girl." "The original is 100 times more beautiful than the pictures," said the king. "Ah, you are joking," said the king of the peacocks. "Sire," said the prince, "here is my brother, who is a king like you. He is a king, and I am a prince. Our sister, whose portrait this is the Princess Rosetta, and we are come to ask you whether you are willing to marry her. She is beautiful and very good, and we will give with her a bushel measure full of golden crowns." "Yes, indeed," said the king, "I will marry her with all my heart. She will want nothing with me, and I will be very fond of her. But I assure you that I expect her to be as fair as her portrait, and if she be in the smallest degree less, so I will put you to death." "Well, we consent," answered Rosetta's 2 brothers. "You consent?" said the king. "Go then to prison and remain there until the princess arrives." The princes left him without a murmur, for they were quite certain that Rosetta was more handsome than her portrait. When they were in prison the king had them well attended to. He went often to see them, and kept in his room Rosetta's portrait, with which he was so infatuated that he slept neither day or night. As the king and his brother were in prison, they wrote to the princess, desiring her to make herself ready and come with all speed to them, for at last the king of the peacocks was found, and was awaiting her arrival. They did not inform her that they were prisoners for fear of making her uneasy. When the princess received the letter she was so transported with joy as to be quite overcome. She told everyone that the king of the peacocks was found, and wished to marry her. Bonfires were lighted, cannons were discharged, and the sugar plums and sweetmeats were universally eaten, and all who came to see the princess during 3 days were presented with a service of cake and wine. After this liberality, she left her fine dolls to her best friends, and placed the government of her brother's kingdom in the hands of the wisest old men of the capital. She recommended them to take care of all, to spend nothing, and to collect money against the king's return. She begged them to keep her peacock, and took with her only her nurse and her foster sister, with her little green dog, Fritillon. They all embarked in a boat on the sea, taking with them a bushel of golden crowns, and a sufficient quantity of clothes to last them 10 years, changing them twice a day, and did nothing but laugh and sing. The nurse at last asked the boatman, are we nearing the kingdom of the peacocks?" "Not yet," said he. Once more she asked him, are we nearing? He said, "Presently, presently." Yet again she asked him, "Are we nearing? Are we nearing?" This time he answered, "Yes." And when he had said so, the nurse came forward and seated herself by him, and said to him, "If you wish it, you shall be rich forever." He answered, "I desire nothing better." She then continued, "If you wish it, then you shall gain lots of dollars." He answered, "I desire nothing better." "Very well," said she. "Tonight, while the princess is asleep, you must assist me to throw her overboard. When she is drowned, I will dress my daughter in her fine clothes, and we will take her to the king of the peacocks, who will be very glad to marry her, and for reward your neck shall be loaded with diamonds." The boatman was very much surprised at what the nurse proposed to him. He told her that it would be a pity to drown so beautiful a princess, and that he was very sorry for her. However, she took a bottle of wine and made him drink so much that he did not know how to refuse her. Night being come, the princess went to bed as usual. Her little Fritillon lay prettily at her feet, without moving a paw. Rosetta was sleeping very soundly, when the wicked nurse, who was watchful enough, left her to fetch the boatman. She brought him where the princess was sleeping, and then, without awakening her, they took her with her feather bed, mattress, sheets, and counterpane, while the foster sister also helped them all she could. They then threw her, bed and all, into the sea, and the princess was sleeping so soundly that she did not awaken. But most fortunately her couch was made of phoenix feathers, which are very scarce, and have this property, that they cannot sink, which caused her to float in her bed as though she had been in a boat. The water, however, gradually wetted her feather bed, then the mattress, and Rosetta, feeling the water, could not tell what it meant. As she turned, she awakened Fritillon. He had an excellent nose, and smelled the cod and soles so near that he began barking at them, which awakened all the other fish. They began swimming about, and the large fishes ran their heads against the princess's bed, which, being held by nothing, turned around and around like a whip top. Oh, was she not surprised! "Is our boat dancing on the water?" said she. "I am not generally so ill at ease as I have been tonight." As Fritillon still kept barking, for he was in despair, the wicked nurse and the boatman heard it from a distance, and said, "That is the princess's comical little dog, drinking with his mistress to our good health. Let us make haste to arrive," for they were now close to the kingdom of the peacocks. The king had sent to the seashore 100 carriages, drawn by all manners of scarce animals. There were lions, bears, stags, wolves, horses, oxen, asses, eagles, and peacocks, and the carriage intended for the Princess Rosetta was drawn by 6 blue apes, who could leap and dance on the tightrope, and play 1,000 pretty tricks. Their harness was very superb, and made of crimson velvet, with plates of gold. There were also 60 young ladies, whom the king had chosen to wait on her. Their clothes were of various colors, and gold and silver were the least valuable of their ornaments. The nurse had been at great trouble to decorate her daughter. She had dressed her in Rosetta's finest gown, with the diamond headdress and lots of jewels, but in spite of her pains, her daughter was as ugly as a monkey. Her hair was black and greasy. She squinted shockingly, her limbs were crooked, she had a large hump between her shoulders, was bad-tempered, slovenly, and always grumbling. When the king of the peacocks people saw her coming out of the boat, they were so surprised that they could not speak. "Heyday, what is the matter?" said she. "Are you all asleep? Make haste and bring me something to eat. You are low wretches, I will have you all hanged." On hearing this, they said among themselves, "What an ugly creature! And she appears to be as wicked as she is ugly. Truly our king will be well married, but I am not surprised when one seeks a wife from the end of the world." She gave as much trouble as she could, and for no offense she struck and boxed the ears of everyone about her. As her equipage was very large, she went along very slowly, and carried her head as high as a queen in her pouch. But all the peacocks, who were perched on the trees to salute her as she passed along, and who had resolved to cry, "Long live beautiful Queen Rosetta," when they saw her so ugly, cried, "Fry, fry, how ugly she is!" She flew into a violent passion upon this, and said to her guards, "Kill those rascals of peacocks who are abusing me." The peacocks, however, quickly flew away, and laughed at her. The roguish boatman, who saw all that passed, said to the nurse, "Gossip, we are not quite right. Your daughter ought to be prettier." She answered, "Silence, blockhead, you will bring some ill luck on us with your prattle." They told the king that the princess was drawing near. "Very well," said he. "Did her brothers tell the truth? Is she more beautiful than her portrait?" "Sire," said the courier, "it is enough that she is as good looking." "Yes, indeed," said the king, "I shall be satisfied. Let us go and see her." For he guessed by the noise in the courtyard that she was now very near, though he could not make out exactly what was said, except that he thought he heard, "Fry, fry, how ugly she is!" He thought, however, that these cries were applied to some dwarf or beast that she had brought with her, for it never entered his mind that they were speaking of the princess herself. The portrait of Rosetta was carried at the end of a long pole, without any covering, and the king slowly walked after it with all his barons, his peacocks, and the ambassadors from the neighboring kingdoms. The king of the peacocks was very impatient to see his dear Rosetta, but in truth, when he did see her, the sight nearly killed him on the spot. He tore his clothes, put himself into the most violent passion, and would not go near her. She quite frightened him. "What!" said he, "have these two scoundrels that I have imprisoned had the boldness to make sport of me, and to propose to marry me to such a baboon as that? They shall die. Come away with this silly woman, her nurse, and all who brought them. Let them be confined in the Round Tower." Meanwhile the king and his brother, who were prisoners, and knew that it was about the time for their sister to arrive, had put on their finest clothes to receive her. Instead, however, of seeing their prison door opened and themselves set at liberty, as they expected, the jailer came with soldiers and made them descend into a dark dungeon, full of noxious reptiles, where they were up to their necks in water. No one could be more surprised or sorrowful than they were. "Alas!" said they to each other, "this is a sorrowful wedding for us. What can have been the cause of such a sad misfortune?" They did not know what to think, excepting that they were doomed to death. They passed 3 days in this miserable plight. At the end of that time the king of the peacocks came an opening that was in the wall, to reproach them. "You have called yourself king and prince," said he, "to entrap me into a marriage with your sister, but you are wretches who are not worth the water you drink. I am about to give you judges who will soon decide your fate, and the rope is twisting with which I will have you hanged." "King of the peacocks," said our king, filled with indignation, "do not proceed so rashly in this affair, for you may yet repent it. I am like you, a king, and have a fine kingdom, robes and crowns, and plenty of money. You seem to think very lightly of hanging us. Have we stolen anything?" When the king heard him speak so resolutely, he knew not what to make of it, and had some thought of sparing their lives, and of letting them go with their sister. But his trusty friend, who was a great parasite, encouraged him, saying that if he did not revenge himself, all the world would laugh at him, and think him a weak prince indeed. So he swore that he would not forgive them, and ordered their trial to proceed. It did not last long, as to condemn them it was merely necessary to compare the portrait of the real Princess Rosetta with the person assuming the name. They were therefore sentenced to be beheaded for having told the king a lie, in promising to him in marriage a beautiful princess, and only given him an ugly country girl. This decree was read very formally to them in prison. When they protested that this had not told a lie, for that their sister was a princess, more beautiful than the day, that there was something passing which they could not comprehend, they demanded a respite of 7 days, stating that in that time something might occur by which their innocence could be established. The king of the peacocks, who was very angry, could hardly grant them this favor, but at last he did so. While all this was passing at the court, we must relate what happened to the poor Princess Rosetta. We have stated that when it was daylight she was very surprised, as was Fretillon also, to find herself out at sea, without a boat or any assistance. She cried so pitifully that all the fishes were sorry for her, and she knew not what to do, or what would become of her. "Certainly," said she, "the King of the Peacocks has ordered me to be thrown into the sea. He has repented his design of marrying me, and to get rid of me decently he would have me drowned. What a silly man!" continued she. "I should have loved him so well, we should have managed so nicely." Then she cried still more, for she could not help loving him. She remained 2 days floating in this manner from one part of the sea to another, drenched to her skin, ready to die with cold, and nearly frozen. Indeed, had it not been for little Fritillon, who kept up a little warmth near her heart, she would have died 100 times. She was dreadfully hungry. She saw oysters in their shells, and took as many as she liked and ate them. Fritillon was not fond of oysters, however; he was obliged to eat some in order to keep himself alive. When night came on, Rosetta was very much alarmed, and she said to her dog, "Fritillon, pray keep barking, for fear the soles should eat us up." He barked all night long, and toward the morning the princess's bed was not very far from shore. There happened to be thereabout a good old man who lived by himself in a little cottage, into which no one but himself ever entered. He was very poor, but very careless of the things of this world. When he heard Fritillon bark he was quite surprised, for there were no dogs about there. It struck him, therefore, that some travelers had lost their way, and he went out kindly to direct them. Suddenly he perceived the princess and Fritillon, who were floating on the sea, and the princess, seeing him, stretched her arms toward him and cried, "Good old man, save me, or I shall perish here, where I have been 2 days languishing." When he heard her speak so sadly, his heart filled with pity for her misfortunes. He immediately fetched from his house a long boat hook, with which he walked into the water till it was up to his neck, and was once or twice nearly drowned. At last he succeeded in dragging the bed to the land. Rosetta and Fritillon were, as may be supposed, very glad to be once more on dry ground. The princess was very thankful to the good old man, and graciously accepted a blanket, which she wrapped around her. Then barefooted she entered his cottage, where he lighted a little fire of dry straw, and took out of his chest a woman's gown with shoes and stockings, in which Rosetta dressed herself, and clad even thus as a poor peasant girl, she was as beautiful as the day. Fritillon, enraptured, danced around her for her amusement. The old man saw very plainly that Rosetta was some grand lady, for her bedclothes were embroidered with gold and silver, and her mattress was covered with satin. He begged her to tell him her story, promising that he would not reveal a word of it without her permission. She told him all from beginning to end, crying bitterly the while, for she still thought that the King of the Peacocks had ordered her to be drowned. "How shall we act, my child?" said the old man to her. "You are a noble princess, used to good living, while I have only black bread and radishes. You will fare but poorly with me, and if you will take my advice, will permit me to go and tell the King of the Peacocks that you are here, for were he to see you he would certainly be too happy to marry you." "Ah, he is a wicked man," said Rosetta, "and would put me to death. But if you have a little basket, do but tie it around my dog's neck, and it will be very unfortunate if he did not bring us something to eat." The old man gave the princess a basket, and she tied it Fritillon's neck, and said to him, "Go to the best saucepan in the city, and bring back whatever is therein." Fritillon ran to the city, and as the king's kitchen was the best, he went into it, sought out the best saucepan, cleverly took out the contents, and returned to his mistress. "Return to the pantry, and fetch me the best thing thence." Fritillon went to the king's pantry, and soon returned with some white bread, muscadine wine, fruits, and sweetmeats. He was so laden that he could not carry more. When it was the King of the Peacocks' dinner time, there was nothing in his saucepan or in his pantry. The servants looked at one another, and the king went into a violent passion. "What!" said he, "so I am to have no dinner? Let the spit be put to the fire, and let me have some nice roast beef this evening." The evening being come, the princess said to Fritillon, "Go to the best kitchen in the city, and fetch me a nice piece of roast meat." Fritillon did as he was told, and thinking that the king's was the best kitchen, he very softly entered it while the cooks' backs were turned, and managed slyly to take away all that was on the spit. It looked so delicious that the very sight of it would have given an appetite to a sick man. He returned with his basketful to the princess, who then sent him back again to the pantry, whence he brought all the king's stewed fruit and sugar plums. The king, having had no dinner, was very hungry in the evening, and wanted his supper early; but as there was nothing for him, he put himself into a terrible rage, and went to bed supperless. The next day at dinner and supper time it was just the same, so that the king was 3 whole days without eating or drinking anything, because whenever he sat down to eat, his food had all been taken away. His confidant, who was afraid that the king would die, hid himself in a corner of the kitchen, keeping his eyes fixed on the saucepan, which was on the fire boiling. He was soon extremely surprised to see enter the kitchen a little green dog, having only one ear, who went to the pot, took the meat out of it, and put it in his basket. Desirous to know where he went to, he followed him out of the town, right up to the old man's door. He then returned and revealed all to the king, telling him that it was a poor peasant that his dinner and supper had gone every day. The king was so very much astonished, and ordered the dog to be sent for. The confidant, in order to make his court to the king, was very willing to show the archers the way. They went accordingly, and found the old man and the princess dining on the king's boiled meat. They were taken and bound with large ropes, and Fritillon the same. When they had arrived, and the king was informed of it, he said, "Tomorrow is the last day I granted to those insulting pretenders, and they shall die with the thieves who have stolen my dinner." He then went into his justice hall. The old man threw himself upon his knees, and said that he would tell him the whole truth. While he was speaking, the king looked at the beautiful princess, and was moved at seeing her tears; but when the good old man declared that she was the Princess Rosetta, and had been thrown into the sea by her wicked attendants, in spite of his weakness, for having been so long without food, the king rushed to embrace her, and untying the ropes with which she was bound, told her that he loved her with all his heart. The princes, who were immediately sent for, thought that they were about to be put to death, and came very sorrowfully, hanging down their heads. At the same time the nurse and her daughters were sent for. When they met, they all recognized each other. Rosetta threw herself into her brother's arms. The nurse, her daughter, and the boatman knelt and asked for pardon. The joy was so great that they were forgiven by the king, and the princess and the good old man was handsomely rewarded, always afterward residing in the palace. Finally, the king of the peacocks made every satisfaction to our king and his brother, testifying his grief that they had been so ill treated. The nurse restored to Rosetta her fine clothes and the bushel of golden crowns, and the wedding feast lasted a fortnight. Everybody rejoiced, even little Fritillon, who ate nothing on the occasion but partridge wings. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15, Babiola. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Victoria Kahn. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. Babiola. There was formerly a queen who would have been entirely happy but for an ungratified desire for children. She spoke of nothing else, and was continually saying that the fairy Fanfreluche, having attended at her birth, and not having been satisfied with the queen, her mother, had gone into a violent passion with her, and had endowed herself, the daughter, with nothing but misfortunes. One day, as she was sitting alone by her fireside, very much afflicted, she saw a little old woman, a span high, come down the chimney. She was riding on a loose bundle of rushes, and wearing in her cap a sprig of hawthorn. Her dress was made of the wings of flies, and 2 walnut shells served her for boots. She sailed in the air, and after going thrice round the chamber, stopped before the queen. "You have," said she to her, "for a long time murmured against me, and have accused me as the author of your misfortunes, laying to my charge all that has happened to you. You think, madam, that I am the cause of your having no children. Now I am come on purpose to announce to you that you will soon have a daughter, but I fear that she will cost you many tears." "Ah, noble Fanferluche," cried the queen, "do not refuse me your pity and assistance. I promise you all the services that lie in my power, provided that the princess you announce to me be my comfort and not my affliction." "Destiny is more powerful than I am," answered the fairy. "All that I can do to show you my affection for you is to give you this sprig of white hawthorn. Secure it to your daughter's head the instant she is born, and it will guard her from many dangers." She gave her the sprig of white hawthorn and vanished like a flash of lightning. The queen remained sad and thoughtful. "What have I desired?" said she. "A daughter who will cost me many tears and sighs? Should I not be more happy to have none at all?" The presence of the king, whom she dearly loved, partly dissipated her grief, but she presently took great care to enjoin her most confidential friends to tie on the young princess' head, as soon as she should be born, the sprig of hawthorn blossom, which she kept in a golden box covered with diamonds, as the thing that she valued more than anything else in the world. At last the queen gave birth to the most beautiful creature that was ever seen. They used the utmost diligence in tying the hawthorn flower on her head, but no sooner was it done than, wonderful to relate, in an instant she became a little monkey, and began to jump, skip, and leap about the chamber like an ordinary monkey. At this metamorphosis all the ladies uttered dreadful screams, and the queen, still more alarmed, was nearly dying of despair. She desired the ladies to remove the sprig of hawthorn from its head. After a great deal of difficulty they laid hold of the little creature and removed the fatal flower from her head, but vainly. She was already a monkey, a confirmed monkey, and required neither suckling nor nursing. All that she wanted was filberts, walnuts, or chestnuts. "Barbarous Fanferluche!" cried the queen sorrowfully. "What have I done to be so cruelly treated by you? What will become of me? What a disgrace will it be to me for all my subjects to think I have given birth unto a monster! What detestation the king will have for such a child!" She burst into tears and begged her ladies to advise her what she should do in so urgent an affair. "Madam," said the senior of her attendants, "the king must be persuaded that the princess is dead, and this monkey must be shut up in a box and thrown into the sea, for it would be a dreadful thing if you were to keep any longer a brute of this kind." The queen would hardly consent to this, but on being told that the king was coming to her room, she was so confused and troubled that, without more deliberation, she told her maids of honor to do what they liked with the little monkey. They then took it into another apartment, enclosed it in a box, and ordered one of the queen's footmen to throw it into the sea. He immediately set out on his errand. Behold, our young princess, then, exposed to extreme danger. The man, seeing that the box was a very nice one, was sorry to part with it, so he seated himself on the seashore and took the little monkey out with the resolution of killing it, for he did not know that it was his sovereign's child. But while he held it in his arms he heard a loud noise which made him turn his head, when he saw an open chariot, resplendent with gold and precious stones, drawn by 6 unicorns and preceded by a band of military music. On the cushions of the chariot sat a queen, bearing her crown and royal mantle, and holding on her lap her little son, who was 4 years old. The footman recognized in this queen his mistress' sister, who had been to congratulate her on the birth of a child, But learning that the young princess was dead, she had very sorrowfully taken her departure on her return to her own kingdom. She was in a profound reverie on the miseries of queens when her son cried out, how I should like to have that little monkey." The queen, looking up, saw the prettiest little monkey that was ever beheld. The footman was for hastily making his retreat, but was prevented. The queen gave him a large sum of money for the monkey, which, being gentle and playful, she called Babiola. Thus, notwithstanding our princess' hard fate, she fortunately fell into the hands of the queen her aunt. When the latter arrived at her court, the little prince begged that he might have Babiola as a playmate. He had dressed her like a princess. New clothes were made for her every day, and she was taught to walk on her feet. It was impossible to find a prettier or more agreeable-looking little monkey. Her little face was as black as jet, with a white frill round her neck, and tufts of red hair round her ears. Her little hands were not larger than the wings of a butterfly, and the vivacity of her eyes gave indications of so much talent that there was no occasion for surprise at any of her wonderful actions. The prince, who was very fond of her, won her heart with his unceasing attentions. She was very careful not to bite him, and whenever she saw him crying, she cried too. She had already been 4 years with the queen when she began to stammer like a child trying to speak. Everybody was mightily surprised at this circumstance, but that surprise was changed to utter amazement when she began to talk in a clear and sweet voice, and so distinctly that not a word of what she said was lost. "Wonderful!" cried all the world. "Babiola speaking! Babiola thinking!" The queen soon wished to have her again for her own amusement, and she was taken to her apartment to the great sorrow of the prince. He cried a great deal at her loss, and to console him, dogs and cats, birds, squirrels, and even a little horse called Cricketin, which danced the saraband, were given to him. But he would have preferred Babiola to them all 50 times over. On her side also the change was not agreeable. She was more constrained with the queen than with the prince. She was required to answer like a sibyl to 100 ingenious and learned questions, which sometimes she could not easily resolve. When a foreign ambassador arrived, she was always shown dressed in a velvet or brocade gown with a frill round her neck. When the court was in mourning, she wore a long black crape mantle, which incommoded her very much. She was not allowed to eat anything for which she felt inclined, a physician always prescribing her food, at which she was not at all pleased, for she was as wayward as might be expected of a little monkey born a princess. The queen appointed her masters, who well exercised the vivacity of her mind. She excelled in playing on the harpsichord, a marvelously good one having been made for her in an oyster shell. Painters came from all the 4 quarters of the world, and especially from Italy, to take her likeness. Her renown spread from pole to pole, for until that time a monkey with the gift of speech had never been heard of. The prince, graceful and witty, and as handsome as painters represent Cupid, was a prodigy no less extraordinary. He visited Babiola, and sometimes amused himself in her company. Their conversations, generally witty and lively, sometimes took a serious and moral turn. Babiola had a heart, and that heart was not metamorphosed, like the rest of her little person. She became then very fond of the prince, in fact, too fond. The unfortunate Babiola did not know what to do. She passed her nights on the top of a window shutter, or in the chimney corner, and would not go into the basket lined with wadding and feathers, very soft and clean, which had been prepared for her. Her governess, for she had one, often heard her sigh, and sometimes complain and weep. Her melancholy increased as her mind expanded, and she never saw herself in a looking-glass without striving, out of vexation, to break it, so that it was commonly said, "A monkey will always be a monkey." Babiola, with all her talents, cannot rid herself of the malicious temper of her species. As the prince grew up, he became fond of hunting, balls, plays, arms, books, but with regard to the little monkey, he hardly ever mentioned her name. Things progressed very differently on her side. She loved him better at 12 years old than she had loved him at 6, and sometimes reproached him for his forgetfulness. He thought that he quite made up for his neglect by giving her a rosy-cheeked apple or some roasted chestnuts, but he very often had her with him when feeling idle and wanting amusement, and the young attendants who came to receive his orders could scarcely help laughing at the grave face that Babiola turned on them. At last, the fame of Babiola's reputation reached the kingdom of the monkeys itself, and King Magotin conceived a violent desire to marry her. With this view he dispatched a famous embassy to ask her of the queen. He had no difficulty in making his prime minister understand his intentions, but the latter would have had infinite trouble to express them but for the assistance of the parrots and magpies, vulgarly called mags. These chattered a great deal, and the jackdaws who followed the equipage would have been very sorry to prattle a bit less than they. A large ape called Mirlifiche was the head of the embassy. He had a fine carriage built of cards, on which were painted the amours of King Magotin and the monkey Monette, famous in the Monkeyan Empire. Poor Monette died most cruelly under the claw of a wild cat, little accustomed to her frolicsome tricks. The happiness of Magotin and Monette during their marriage was represented, and the sensible grief in which the king had indulged on her decease. 6 white rabbits of an excellent breed drew this carriage, which was called by way of distinction the state carriage. It was followed by a chariot constructed of straw, painted with various colors, and which contained the monkeys destined to attend Babiola. You should have seen how they were adorned. They seemed indeed to be going to a wedding. The remainder of the retinue was composed of little spaniels, small greyhounds, Spanish cats, Muscovy rats, a few hedgehogs, cunning weasels, and dainty foxes. Some drove the chariots, others carried the baggage. At the head of the whole went Mirlifiche, graver than a Roman dictator, wiser than Cato, and mounted on a young leveret which ambled better than the nicest English nag. The queen knew nothing of this magnificent embassy until it arrived at her palace, the bursts of laughter from the people and her guards causing her to look out at the window. She beheld the most extraordinary cavalcade she had ever seen in her life. On its arrival, Mirlifiche, followed by a considerable number of apes, advanced toward the chariot containing the monkeys, and giving his paw to the large monkey called Gigonia, he assisted her to descend. Then, loosing the little parrot which was to serve as his interpreter, he awaited that splendid bird's presenting itself to the queen, and asking an audience for himself. The parrot, gently rising in the air, went to the window at which the queen was standing, and said to her, in the prettiest voice in the world, "Madam, His Excellency Count Mirlifiche, ambassador from the most renowned Magotin, king of all the monkeys, demands an audience of your majesty to treat on business of the utmost importance." "My pretty parrot," said the queen, caressing him, "you had better first take something to eat, and a glass of wine, after which I consent to your telling Count Mirlifiche that he is very welcome to my kingdom, with all who accompany him. If his journey hither from Magosha has not too much fatigued him, he may immediately enter my audience chamber, where I shall await him on my throne with all my court." At these words the parrot kissed his foot twice, flapped his wings, sang a little air in token of his joy, and, resuming his flight, he soon perched on Mirlifiche's shoulder and whispered in his ear the favorable answer he had just received. Mirlifiche was not insensible to the kindness with which he was received, and immediately desired Margot, a magpie who set himself up for sub-interpreter, to ask one of the Queen's officers for a room in which he might repose for a short time, previous to his expected audience. He was immediately shown into an apartment, paved with marble, painted and gilded, and altogether one of the neatest in the palace. He had no sooner entered it with part of his suite than, as apes are all very inquisitive searchers, they ferreted out a certain corner in which divers pots of sweetmeats were arranged. Behold our gluttons then, one with a glass jar of apricots, another with a bottle of syrup, one with pastry, another with a la campagne. The chattering gentry who composed part of the cortege were vexed at seeing a repast in which there was neither hemp seed nor millet seed, and a magpie, a mighty great talker, flew into the audience chamber, and respectfully approaching the Queen, "Madam," said he to her, "I am too devoted a servant of your Majesty to be a willing accomplice in the havoc which is making in your nice sweetmeats. Count Mirlifiche has already eaten 3 boxes himself. He was busily engaged discussing the 4th without any respect to your Majesty, when my heart, being moved at so shocking an abuse of your Majesty's hospitality, I left to inform you of the fact." "I thank you kindly, my pretty little magpie," said the Queen, smiling, "but I dispense with your anxious zeal for my jars of sweetmeats. I abandon them in honor of Babiola, whom I love with all my heart." The magpie, rather ashamed of the much ado about nothing which he had made, retired without saying a word. The ambassador, followed by his suite, shortly after entered the apartment. He was not dressed quite in the fashion of the day. Indeed, since the loss of the famous Phaeton, ambassador from the court of the Tuileries to that of King Magotin, and who had cut such a figure in the monkey world, they had no good model. His hat was pointed at the top, and he wore in it a green feather. He wore a blue paper shoulder belt covered with gold spangles, large bows of ribbons at his knees, and he carried a walking stick. Immediately on his entering the room, the parrot, who had the reputation of being a tolerably good poet, having composed a very grave harangue, advanced to the foot of the throne on which the Queen was seated, and, addressing himself to Babiola, spoke as follows: "Know the great power, O royal dame, of those all bright and star-like eyes. Magotin feels the tender flame, and apes and cats a loving train tell in sweet music his young sighs. The fair Monette, his former love, with a wild cat in combat strove, and when the gentle monkey fell, Magotin loved his queen so well, he vowed eternal truth, for then he felt he ne'er could love again. But you have made the king forget the fainter charms of Queen Monette. Sweet Long Tail once Magotin sat, enthroned a very king in fat, but vacant now is half his throne, and naught is left but skin and bone, for once believe a poet true, he's dying, monkey dear, for you. Olives and nuts he used to eat, such pleasant fruits his realms abound in. He cracked the nuts, his favorite meat, and threw the shells at all around him. These were his freaks. Alas, such sport has ever fled Magotin's court. Unless you deign, most noble queen, to cure his kingship of the spleen, oh, half the riches, who can tell, of the rich realms you'll then reign over. Figs, raisins, nuts will please you well. You'll be the greatest monkey belle, and the first monkey be your lover." During this discourse, the Queen turned her eyes toward Babiola, who, for her part, was more disconcerted than she had ever been before in the whole course of her life. The Queen was anxious to ascertain the sentiments of Babiola before she made any answer. She, however, told the parrot to give His Excellency the ambassador to understand that she favored his king's pretensions, and would further the marriage in all that depended on her. The audience being over, she retired, and was followed into her closet by Babiola. "My little monkey," said the queen to her, "I must confess that I shall be very sorry to part with you, but there would be great danger in denying Magotin, who asks you in marriage, for I have not yet forgotten that his father sent 200,000 apes into the field to wage a fierce war against our kingdom, and they devoured so many of our subjects that we were obliged to conclude a shameful peace." "Then I am to understand, madam," replied Babiola impatiently, "that you have resolved to sacrifice me to this vile monster in order to avoid his anger. I entreat your majesty, however, to grant me at least a delay of a few days, when I will acquaint you with my final resolution." "That is but right," said the queen, "but if you take my advice, you will determine promptly. Consider the honors that await you, the magnificence of the embassy, and the maids of honor who are sent for you." "I do not know what he may have done for Monette," replied little Babiola disdainfully, "but I know very well that I am but little moved by the sentiments with which he affects to honor me." Thereupon she arose, and after courtesying gracefully, quitted the closet in search of the prince, to relate her sorrows to him. Directly he saw her, he called out, "Well, Babiola, when shall we have the pleasure of dancing at your wedding?" "I do not know, sir," said she sorrowfully, "but I find myself in so deplorable a condition that it is no longer in my power to withhold my secret from you, and although it puts my delicacy to the blush, I must confess to you that you are the only person whom I could have wished to have for a husband." "Husband!" said the prince, bursting into a loud laugh. "Husband, indeed! Oh, my little monkey, I am charmed at what you tell me. I hope, however, that you will excuse me if I do take advantage of your confession, for in truth, neither in height, looks, or manners are we quite suited to each other." "I agree with you," said she, "and most especially our hearts are not alike. You are an ingrate. I have long perceived it, and I am very foolish to feel an affection for a prince who is so little worthy of it." "But, Babiola," said he, "think now, were we married, what anxiety I should feel to see you at the top of a sycamore tree, hanging from a branch by your tail. Take my advice. Let us laugh at this affair for the sake of your honor and my own. Marry King Magotin, and in token of the good friendship that subsists between us, send me your first baby." "It is fortunate for you, sir," added Babiola, "that I am not quite a monkey in my mind, any other than I would have already scratched out your eyes, bitten off your nose, and torn off your ears, but I abandon you to the reflections that you will one day make on your unworthy conduct." She could say no more, for her governess came in to inform her that the ambassador Mirlifiche had gone to her apartment with magnificent presents. They consisted of a toilette of spider's web, embroidered with little glowworms, an eggshell serving to hold the combs, and a white heart cherry for a pincushion, all the linen being ornamented with paper lace. There were besides, in a basket, several shells properly arranged, some serving as drops to earrings, others for bodkins, etc., and all as brilliant as diamonds. But better than all these were a dozen boxes of sweetmeats, and a little glass box which contained a nut and an olive. The key of the box, however, was lost, at which Babiola was rather vexed. The ambassador informed her in grumbling, which is the language made use of in the kingdom of Magotia, that his monarch was more moved with her charms than he had ever been by those of any other monkey, that he was building a palace for her in the topmost branches of a fir tree, that he had sent her these presents, and particularly the nice sweetmeats, to show his attachment. But, added he, the strongest proof of his kindness, and the one of which you ought to be most sensible, is, madam, the care he has taken to have his portrait painted, that you may anticipate in some measure the pleasure you will feel on seeing himself. He thereupon displayed the portrait of the King of the Apes, seated on a large block of wood, eating an apple. Babiola turned her face on one side so as to look no longer on so disagreeable a figure, and, grumbling 2 or 3 times, she gave Mirlifiche to understand that she was obliged to his master for his esteem, but that she had not yet made up her mind whether she would marry or remain single. Meantime the queen had determined not to incur the monkey's anger, and by no means thinking that any great ceremony was requisite in sending Babiola where she intended she should go, she had everything prepared for her departure. On hearing of this, despair took entire possession of Babiola's mind. The prince's contempt on one hand, the queen's indifference on the other, and still more the idea of such a husband, determined her to make her escape. This was not a very difficult thing, for since she had been able to speak, she had not been tied up. She went and came at pleasure, and as often entered her room by the window as by the door. She made haste, therefore, to set out, and leaping from tree to tree and from branch to branch, she reached the bank of a river. The excess of her despair prevented her fully comprehending the danger she ran in trying to swim across it, so without a moment's consideration she plunged in, and immediately sank to the bottom. As she did not lose her senses, she looked about her and perceived a magnificent grotto, adorned all over with shells. She entered, and was received by a venerable old man whose long white beard reached below his waist. He was seated on a couch of reeds and flags. He wore on his head a crown of wild poppies, and was reclining against a rock, whence sprang several fountains which augmented the river.
"Ah, what has brought you here, little Babiola?"
said he, offering his hand. "Sir," answered she, "I am an unfortunate little monkey, and am flying from a frightful ape, whom they wish to make my husband."
"I know more of your story than you imagine,"
answered the wise old man.
"It is true that you abhor Magotin, but it is no less true that you are in love with a young prince who returns your love with indifference."
"Ah, sir," cried Babiola, sighing, "let us not speak of him. His remembrance augments my grief."
"He will not always be insensible to love," continued the companion of the fishes. "I know that he is destined for the fairest princess in the world."
"Unfortunate that I am," said Babiola. "Then he will never be mine."
The good man smiled and said to her, "Do not afflict yourself, my good Babiola. Time is a powerful master. Only be careful not to lose the little glass box that King Magotin sent you, and as you have got it, by good luck, in your pocket, I need say no more about it to you. Here is a crocodile who travels very steadily. Seat yourself on its back, and it will conduct you where you ought to go."
"After the obligations that you have imposed on me," said she to him, "I cannot depart without knowing your name."
"I am called Biroqua," said he, "father of the river by that name, which is, as you may perceive, rather large and famous."
Babiola then seated herself on the crocodile's back very confidently, and they travelled for some time on the water. After passing rather a long winding, the crocodile reached the bank. It would have been difficult to find anything more tasteful than its English saddle and the rest of its harness. There were even little pistols in the saddle bow, the holsters for which were made of the shells of crabs. Babiola was proceeding on her journey with entire confidence in the sage Biroqua's promises, when she suddenly heard a loud noise.
Alas, alas! It was the ambassador Mirlifiche and his retinue, who were returning to Magosha, sorrowful and desolate at Babiola's flight. An ape of this troop had mounted a walnut tree, and was knocking down walnuts for the amusement of the retinue, when just as he had reached the highest branches, he perceived Babiola seated on a crocodile which was slowly traveling up the open country. At this sight he uttered such a loud shout that the assembled apes asked him anxiously in their language what was the matter. No sooner had he told them than the parrots, magpies, and jackdaws were immediately let loose, and flew to where she was, and on their report, the ambassador, the monkeys, and the remainder of the equipage hastened to arrest her. What a misfortune for Babiola! A greater or more terrible it would have been difficult to bring upon her. She was obliged to get into the state carriage, which was thereupon surrounded by vigilant monkeys, some foxes, and a cock who perched on the roof and kept watch day and night. An ape, leading the crocodile as a very rare animal, brought up the rear of the cavalcade, which continued its journey to the great grief of Babiola, whose only companion was Madame Gigonia, a peevish, ill-tempered monkey. At the end of 3 days, which passed without any adventure, the guides lost their way, and they all arrived at a large town of which they did not know the name, but seeing a fine garden, the door of which was open, they halted therein, and fell upon everything it contained, as though they had been in a conquered country. One cracked walnuts, another gobbled cherries, while a third robbed a plum tree. In a word, there was not a little monkey brat among them who did not both eat and lay in a good store. You must know that this town was the capital of the kingdom in which Babiola had been born, that the queen, her mother, resided there, and that since the misfortune she had experienced in seeing her daughter metamorphosed into a monkey by the sprig of hawthorn, she would not allow either monkey, marmoset, or baboon to remain in the kingdom, or anything which might recall the fatal and deplorable adventure to her remembrance. An ape was then looked upon as a disturber of the public peace. Judge, then, of the universal astonishment of the people at seeing a carriage of card arrive, with a chariot of painted straw and the rest of this most surprising monkey equipage, perhaps the most extraordinary that was ever seen since tales were tales and fairies were fairies. The news flew like lightning to the palace, and the queen was astounded, fearing that the long-tailed gentry were about to attack her authority. She promptly assembled her council, issued a proclamation condemning them all as guilty of high treason, and, not wishing to lose an opportunity of making so famous an example for the future, she sent her guards into the garden with orders to seize upon all the monkeys. They threw large nets over the trees, and soon brought their chase to a conclusion. And notwithstanding the high respect due to the quality of ambassador, that character suffered so much in the person of Mirlifiche that he was unmercifully thrown to the bottom of a cave and put under a large empty tub, where he and his comrades were imprisoned with the lady monkeys who had accompanied Babiola. For her part, she felt a secret joy at this turn in her affairs. When misfortunes reach a certain point they cease to afflict, and even death is met without a murmur. This was precisely her situation, her heart being occupied by the image of a prince who despised her, and her mind filled with the frightful idea of King Magaton, whose wife she was about to become. For the rest, I must not forget to state that her clothes were so pretty, and her manners so uncommon, that those who had taken her stayed to regard her as something marvelous, and when she spoke to them their astonishment was not a little augmented, although they had already heard of the admirable Babiola. The queen, who had found her, being unacquainted with her niece's metamorphosis, had frequently written to her sister that she had a very wonderful little monkey, and had requested her to come and see it, but the afflicted queen had always hastily passed over that part of the letter without reading it. The guards, transported with admiration, carried Babiola to a large gallery, and having erected a little throne, she ascended it more like a sovereign than a captive monkey,
and the queen, accidentally passing, was so forcibly struck with her pretty appearance and the gracious compliments she paid her, that in spite of herself, nature spoke in the child's favor. She took her up in her arms. The little creature, animated on her side with feelings that she had never before experienced, threw herself on the queen's neck, and said such tender and engaging things that she struck everybody who heard her with admiration. "No, great queen," cried she, "it is not the fear of approaching death with which I learn you have threatened the unfortunate race of monkeys that terrifies me, or induces me to take the means of pleasing and softening you. The close of my life is not the greatest misfortune that could befall me, and I possess feelings so much above my condition that I should regret even the least step taken to preserve that life. No, madam, it is for yourself alone that I love you. Your crown moves me much less toward you than your merit." What answer could the queen make to so courteous and complimentary a speech? More dumb than a carp, she stared with surprise, thinking that she was in a dream, and feeling her heart very much affected. She carried the monkey to her closet. When they were alone, she said to her, "Do not delay a moment the relation of your adventures to me, for I feel that of all the animals which people my menageries, and which I keep in my palace, you will be the one that I shall love the most. I assure you that on your account I will even pardon the apes who accompany you." "Ah, madam," cried Babiola, "I ask you nothing for them. My misfortune was to be born a monkey, and the same misfortune has gifted me with a discernment which will make me suffer until my death. For, in a word, what do I not feel when I see myself in a looking-glass, little, ugly, and black, having paws covered with hair, with a long tail and teeth always ready to bite, being conscious at the same time that I have taste, delicacy, and feelings, and do not want intelligence." "Are you capable," said the queen, "of feeling an attachment?" Babiola sighed, but made no answer. "Oh," continued the queen, "you must tell me whether you love an ape, a rabbit, or a squirrel, for if you are disengaged I have a dwarf who will be an excellent match for you." At this proposition, Babiola put on a disdainful air, at which the queen laughed heartily. "Do not afflict yourself," said she to her, "and inform me by what miracle you speak." "All that I know of my adventures," replied Babiola, "is that the queen your sister had no sooner quitted you after the birth and death of the princess your daughter than she saw, as she was passing the seashore, one of your valets who was on the point of drowning me. I was forcibly taken from him by her order, and by the most unheard-of prodigy in the world, speech and reason came to me. Many masters were appointed to teach me various languages, and to play on musical instruments. At last, madam, I became sensible of my misfortunes, but what ails you, madam?" cried she, seeing the queen's countenance pale and covered with a cold perspiration. "Whence this extraordinary change which I remark in your person?" "I am dying," said the queen, in a feeble and inarticulate voice. "I am dying, my dear and too unfortunate daughter. To-day, then, I have at last recovered you." At these words she fainted away. The terrified Babiola ran for assistance. The queen's ladies hastened to give her water, to unlace her stays, and to put her in bed, and Babiola crept into bed with her without observation, being extremely small. When the queen returned to herself after the long swoon into which the Princess Discourse had thrown her, she desired to be left alone with the ladies who were acquainted with the secret of her daughter's fatal birth, and informed them of what had befallen her, at which they were so dismayed that they knew not how to advise her. She commanded them, however, to tell her what they thought she had better do in so grievous a juncture. Some advised her to have the monkey stifled, others to shut her up in a hole, and a third party to have her sent back again to the sea. The queen cried and sobbed.
"She is so clever," said she. "What a pity to see her reduced to this miserable condition by an enchanted sprig of hawthorn. But," continued she is my daughter and my blood. It is I who have drawn upon her the wicked Fanferluche's wrath, and is it just that she should suffer for the hatred that fairy bears to me?" "But, madam," cried her old lady of honor, "we must save your reputation. What would the world think if you were to declare that a monkey were your child? It is unnatural for so beautiful a person as you to have such children." The queen lost all patience at hearing her argue in this way, but soon consented with no less warmth that it was necessary to exterminate the little monster. At last, however, her Majesty resolved to shut up Babiola in a castle, where she would be well nursed and kindly treated during the remainder of her life. When Babiola heard that the queen intended to put her in prison, she quietly slipped out of the bed, and, jumping from the window on to a tree in the garden, she made her escape into a large forest, and left everybody in alarm at not finding her. She passed the night in the hollow of an oak tree, in which she had time to reflect on the cruelty of her fate. But what most pained her was the necessity she was under of quitting the queen. However, she preferred being her own mistress in voluntary exile to losing her liberty forever. On the appearance of daylight she continued her journey without knowing whither she was to go, and considering and reconsidering 1,000 times the singularity of so extraordinary an adventure. "What a difference," cried she, "between what I am and what I ought to be!" Tears fell in abundance from the little eyes of poor Babiola. She, however, journeyed on, sometimes fearful that the queen might pursue her, and sometimes alarmed lest some of the monkeys who had escaped from the cave might seize on and take her against her will to the King Magaton, but still proceeding, without following either road or footpath, she at last arrived at a large desert, in which there was neither house nor tree, fruit, grass, nor spring. She entered on it without reflection, and it was not until she began to feel hungry that she discovered, too late, the extent of her imprudence in attempting to travel through such a country. 2 days and 2 nights she passed without being able to catch even a gnat or a little worm, and fear of death seized her. She became so weak that she swooned and fell on the earth, when, remembering the olive and the nut that were still in the little glass box, she thought that she might make a light repast of them. Joyful at this ray of hope, she picked up a stone, broke the box in pieces, and began to eat the olive. Hardly had she put her teeth therein when an abundance of perfumed oil flowed from it, which, falling on her paws, they immediately became the most delicate hands in the world. Her surprise, as may be imagined, was extreme. She instantly took some of this oil and rubbed herself all over with it, when, marvelous to relate, she made herself so beautiful that nothing in the world could equal her charms. She felt that she had large eyes, a small mouth, and a handsome nose. She was dying for want of a looking-glass. At last she bethought herself of making one of the largest piece of glass of her broken box. Oh, what joy! Oh, what delight! When she saw her own loveliness. Her clothes had changed with herself, her hair fell in 1,000 flowing ringlets, and her complexion was as fresh as the flowers in spring. The first moments of her surprise being past, her hunger became still more violent, and her sorrow augmented proportionately. "What," said she, "so beautiful and so young, born princess as I am, must I perish in this desolate spot? Oh, cruel fortune, that hast conducted me here, to what hast thou destined me? Is it to add to afflictions alone that thou hast wrought so happy and so unhoped for a change in my person? And thou, O venerable Biroqua, who didst so generously save my life, wilt thou too leave me to perish in this frightful solitude?"
In vain did the poor princess invoke assistance in this solitary desert. Not even echo answered to her voice. The want of food tormented her to such a degree that she at last took the nut and cracked it, when, as she threw the shell from her, she was amazed to see issue therefrom architects, painters, masons, upholsterers, sculptors, and all kinds of different workmen. They immediately commenced operations. Some designed a palace, others built it, and others furnished it. One party painted the rooms, another cultivated the gardens. All was resplendent with gold and azure. No sooner was this done than a sumptuous repast was served, and 60 princesses, more handsomely dressed than queens, led by squires, and followed by pages, came and paid Babiola the highest compliments, inviting her to the feast that was awaiting her. It may be supposed that she did not require much persuasion. She immediately advanced toward the saloon, and there, seating herself at the table with a queenly air, she ate like one famished. No sooner had she risen from table than her treasurers brought into her presence 15,000 large coffers, as large as hogsheads, full of gold and diamonds. They asked her if she would allow them to pay the workmen who built her palace. She said that that was but right, but made it a condition that they should also build near it a town, marry, and settle therein. To this they all consented, and the town was finished in 3/4 of an hour, although it was 50 times larger than Rome. Behold the numerous prodigies which issued from a little nut. The princess resolved to send a splendid embassy to the queen her mother, and to take this opportunity of deservedly reproaching the young prince her cousin for his former treatment of her. While taking the necessary measures for this purpose, she amused herself by witnessing ring races, she always giving the prize. She also went to the theatre, hunted and fished, for a river had also been conducted thither. The fame of her beauty soon spread itself over all the earth, and kings from its 4 quarters came to pay her court, and also giants taller than mountains, and figures smaller than rats. It happened one day during a grand festival and tournament that as several knights were breaking lances, a quarrel arose, and, disregardful of her presence, they fought in earnest. The princess, in anger, descended from her balcony to ascertain and punish the originators of the strife, and to assist the wounded, when, as the visor of one of these was raised, what were her feelings at seeing the prince her cousin? Though not quite dead, he was so severely injured that she was herself nearly dying with surprise and grief. She had him instantly borne to the finest apartment in the palace, where nothing requisite to effect his cure was wanting. The best medicine, eminent surgeons, nice broth and syrups, all were there. Babiola herself made the bandages and lint, watering them with her tears which might have served as a balsam for her wounded cousin. Wounded indeed he was, in more than one sense of the word, for without reckoning 6 sword and as many lance wounds which had pierced him through and through, he had been at that court for some time incognito, and had felt the power of Babiola's eyes to an incurable extent. It is then easy to judge what were his feelings when he read in that amiable princess' countenance that she was in the utmost grief at witnessing the condition to which he was reduced. I will not stop to repeat to you the terms in which his heart prompted him to thank her for the kindness she had manifested toward him. Those who heard him were surprised that so sick a man should be able to show so much passion and gratitude. The Princess Babiola, who blushed more than once at it, begged him to be silent, but his emotion and the ardor of his protestations were so extreme that she saw him suddenly sink in dreadful anguish. Until then she had borne all with firmness, but on seeing him in so terrible a condition she uttered loud cries, tore her hair, and gave everybody reason to think that her heart must be of easy access, since in so short a time it could feel so great a passion for a stranger. For it was not known in Babiola's kingdom that the prince was her cousin,
and that she had loved him from her earliest youth. It appears that, while traveling, the prince was attracted by Babiola's reputation to her court, and being unacquainted with anyone there who could introduce him to the princess, he thought that nothing could so well serve his turn as the performance in her presence of 5 or 6 heroic feats, such as cutting off the legs, arms, or heads of a few knights in a tournament. He found, however, no one complacent enough to allow him so to do. A rude scuffle then ensued. The strongest party, as usual, beat the weaker, and to that weaker party unfortunately belonged, as I have already stated, our prince. Babiola, in despair, ran along the highway without either carriage or guards. She entered a wood, and fainted away at the foot of a tree, whence the fairy Fanferluche, who never slept, but was always seeking opportunities for evil actions, carried her on a cloud blacker than ink, and which sailed along more swiftly than the wind. The princess remained for some time insensible. When she recovered, nothing could equal her surprise at finding herself so far from the earth and so near to the pole. The footing on clouds is not very solid, so that as she ran to and fro she seemed to be treading on feathers, and the cloud separating at times, she had much difficulty to prevent herself from falling. She found no one with whom to share her grief, for the wicked Fanferluche had rendered herself invisible. She had time to think of her dear prince and the condition in which she had left him, and gave way to the most mournful thoughts that can take possession of the mind. "What," cried she, "am I capable of surviving him I love, and of allowing the fear of approaching death to find a place in my heart? Ah! If the sun would scorch me to death with his beams, what a good office would he render me! If I could drown myself in the rainbow, how happy I should be! But alas, all the zodiac is deaf to my voice. Sagittarius for me has no arrows, for me the bull no horns, and the lion no teeth. Perhaps the earth will be more obliging, and will offer to me at least the point of a rock on which I may slay myself. Oh, prince, dear, dear cousin, why art thou not here to witness for thy sake the most tragical leap on which desperate lover ever resolved?" As she finished these words, she ran to the end of the cloud and precipitated herself from it like an arrow shot from an English bow. All who saw her thought that the moon was falling, and as Cynthia was just then on the wane, several people who adored her, and who remained some time without seeing her again, put on deep mourning for her loss, persuading themselves that the sun, in a fit of jealousy, had done the moon this evil turn. However great the princess' wish for death, die she did not. She fell into a glass bottle in which the fairies generally keep their ratafia in the sun. But what a bottle! There is not a tower in the world so large. Fortunately it was empty, or she must have been drowned therein like a fly. The 6 giants who guarded it immediately recognized Babiola. They were the same who had resided in her court and who loved her, as did all the world, but the malignant Fanferluche. She, who did nothing by chance, had transported each of these giants hither on a flying dragon, and the 6 dragons guarded the bottle while the giants slept. While Babiola was there, she frequently regretted her monkey skin. She lived like the chameleon on air and dew. The prison in which she was thus confined was unknown to anyone. Of course, therefore, the young prince, her cousin, was ignorant of it, for he was not dead, but unceasingly asked for Babiola. He easily perceived from the melancholy looks of all who attended on him that there was some subject of general grief at court. His natural discretion prevented him seeking to learn what it might be, but when convalescent he pressed so earnestly that he was apprised of the prince's loss, for they had not the courage to conceal it longer from him. Those who had seen her enter the wood maintained that she had been devoured by lions. A second party thought she had destroyed herself in despair, and others opined that she had lost her wits and was wandering over the world. As this latter opinion was the least terrible, and as it gave the prince a slight ground for hope, he seized upon it. and set out on his horse Cricketen, of whom I have already spoken, but of whom I forgot to say that he was descended from Bucephalus, and one of the best horses of the age in which he flourished. The prince was attended by 2 of his most faithful followers. Putting the bridle on his horse's neck, the prince allowed him to choose his own road. Sometimes he called upon the princess, but in vain. Echo alone replied. At last he arrived at the bank of a large river. Cricketen was thirsty, and went into it to drink, and the prince, continuing to shout at the top of his lungs, "Babiola! Beautiful Babiola, where are you?" he heard a voice whose sweetness seemed to charm the waves. "Advance," it replied, "and you shall learn where she is." At these words, the prince, as daring as he was affectionate, gave Cricketen 2 or 3 thrusts with his spurs, which made him swim onward until he came to a gulf in which the water precipitated itself more rapidly, when the prince sank with his horse to the bottom, thoroughly persuaded that he was on the point of being drowned. He luckily, however, had arrived at the residence of the good man Biroqua, who was then celebrating the wedding of his daughter with one of the richest and deepest rivers in the country. All the aquatic deities were in his grotto, where the tritons and the sirens were making a charming melody, and the river Biroqua, lightly dressed, was dancing gaily with the Thames, the Seine, the Euphrates, and the Ganges, who had certainly come a long distance to amuse themselves together. Cricketen, who was very polite, stayed very respectfully at the entrance of the grotto, and the prince, still more polite than his horse, made a low bow and asked if it were permitted for a mortal like him to make his appearance in the midst of so distinguished an assembly. Biroqua spoke with an affable air, and replied that they would feel both honored and gratified by his presence. "I have been waiting for you some days," continued he. "I am in your interests, sir, and those of the princess are likewise dear to me. You must rescue her from the fatal place in which the vindictive Fanferluche has imprisoned her. She is in a bottle." "Ah, what do you tell me?" cried the prince, interrupting him. "My princess in a bottle?" "Yes," answered the wise old man, "and she is greatly distressed. But I warn you, sir, that it is by no means an easy task to conquer the giants and dragons who guard her, at least if you do not follow my advice. You must leave your good horse here, and mount a winged dolphin, which I have been training for you a long time." He then had the dolphin brought, saddled and bridled, and it pranced and curveted so well that Cricketen was quite jealous of him. Biroqua and his companions immediately set about arming the prince. They equipped him in a brilliant cuirass of gilded carp scales. His headpiece consisted of a large periwinkle shell, shaded by a large cod's tail which hung in the form of a handsome plume of heron's feathers. A naiad girded him with an eel, from which hung a formidable sword made of the backbone of a large fish, and he was then presented with a magnificent tortoise shell as a shield. Thus equipped, not the smallest gudgeon who saw him but conceived that he beheld the god of souls, and verily the young prince had a certain air that is rarely met with among mortals. Hope springs eternal in the human breast, and that of soon finding the charming princess with whom he was in love inspired our prince with a joy that he had been incapable of feeling since her loss. The chronicle whence this authentic tale is extracted relates that he ate with a very good appetite at Biroqua's table, and that he thanked all the company for their kindness in no common terms, after which he rose from table, bade adieu to Cricketen, then, mounting the winged fish, he immediately set out. At the close of the day the prince found himself already so high that he entered for the sake of a little rest into the kingdom of the moon. The rarities that he observed there, and which have been so well described by later travelers, would have arrested his serious attention if he had not had a more pressing object in view. to wit, that of liberating Babiola from the bottle in which she had then been residing several months. Day no sooner broke than away he rode on his dolphin again, and long ere noon he had discovered the princess surrounded by the giants and dragons that the fairy, by virtue of her little wand, had retained near her, and so little idea had Fanferluche that any one was powerful enough to free Babiola from captivity, that she confidently reposed on the vigilance of her terrible guards, with the certainty of its prolongation. The lovely Babiola was pitifully looking toward heaven, and addressing there her sorrowful lamentations, when she saw the flying dolphin and the prince who was coming to her deliverance. She could hardly believe her eyes when she saw an armed knight near her bottle, although she knew from her own experience that to some persons the most extraordinary things are of easy accomplishment. "May it not be through the malice of some wicked fairies," said she, "that this knight is thus transported through the air? Alas! how much I pity him, if a bottle or carafe is destined for his prison as it serves for mine." While these reflections occupied her mind, the giants, who perceived the prince over their head and took him for a kite which some little boy in the moon was flying, cried out to each other, "Lay hold of this string, lay hold of this string, it will serve to divert us." But while under this impression they stooped to pick him up, he fell on them, cut and thrust, and knocked them into as many pieces as a pack of cards cut and thrown to the wind. On hearing the first noise of this encounter, the princess turned her head and recognized her own dear prince. Oh, what joy to be certain that he was as yet alive! But oh, what anxiety to see him exposed to such perils, fighting in the midst of the terrible giants and dragons which were then attacking him. She uttered fearful cries, and his danger nearly cost her her life. However, the enchanted fishbone sword, with which Biroqua had armed the prince, struck no useless blows, and the nimble dolphin, rising and stooping just at the proper times, was a marvelous help to the prince, so that in a short time the field was covered with these monsters. The impatient prince, who saw his princess through the glass, would have broken it in pieces if he had not been fearful of wounding her, so he determined on descending through the neck of the bottle. When he reached the bottom, he threw himself at Babiola's feet and respectfully kissed her hand. "Sir," said she to him, "it is well, in order that you may restrain your emotions, that I inform you of the motives which have interested me so tenderly in your preservation. Learn, then, that we are nearly related, that I am the daughter of the queen your aunt, and that same Babiola whom you found in the form of a little monkey on the seashore, who was weak enough to express for you an attachment, and whom you despised." "Ah, madam," cried the prince, "can I believe so unheard of a prodigy? What, you have been a monkey? You have loved me, and I have known your love, and my heart has been capable of refusing the greatest of earthly blessings." "Well," replied the princess, smiling at his surprise, "I should now, perhaps, have but a very poor opinion of your taste had you then conceived any attachment for me. But let us depart. I am tired of my prison, and I fear my enemy. Let us go to the queen, my mother, and inform her of all these extraordinary events, which cannot fail to interest her." "With all my heart, madam," said the amorous prince, and getting on the winged dolphin's back and taking her in his arms, "Let us go," said he, "and restore to her, in you, the most amiable princess in the world." The dolphin gently rose in the air, winging his course toward the capital in which the queen was spending her sorrowful existence. The flight of Babiola did not leave her a moment's repose. She could not help thinking of her favorite, and thus continually calling to her remembrance the pretty things that Babiola had said to her. Monkey as she was, the queen would have given half her kingdom for another sight of her. When the prince arrived, he disguised himself as an old man, and demanded a private audience of the queen. "Madam," said he, "I have studied from my most tender youth the necromantic art. You may judge of my skill by the fact that I am not ignorant of the hatred that Fanferluche bears toward you, or of its disastrous effects. But dry your tears, madam, for that same Babiola whom you have seen so ugly is now about to be restored to you, the most beautiful princess in the world, provided, however, that you will pardon the queen your sister for the cruel war that she has waged against you, and conclude the peace by marrying the Princess Babiola with the prince your nephew."
"I cannot flatter myself that what you affirm is true," replied the queen, weeping. "Wise old man, you wish to soothe my affliction. I have lost my dear daughter. I have no longer a husband. My sister pretends that my kingdom belongs to her. Her son is as unjust as his mother. They both persecute me, and I will enter into no alliance with them."
"Fate wills it otherwise," continued he, "and I am commissioned to tell you so."
"Ah, but of what use would it be," added the queen, "to consent to this marriage? The wicked Fanferluche has too much power and is too malicious not to oppose it always."
"Do not alarm yourself on that score, madam," replied the good man. "Promise me only that you will not oppose the marriage in question."
"I promise everything," cried the queen, "provided I see my dear daughter once again." The prince went out and ran to where the princess was awaiting him. She was surprised to see him disguised, which made it necessary for him to relate to her that for some time past the two queens had had violent altercations, and that there had been much animosity between them, but that at last he had made his aunt consent to his wishes. The princess was in ecstasies. She went to the palace, and all who met her observed so perfect a resemblance in her to the queen, her mother, that curiosity induced them to follow her to learn who she was. When the queen perceived her, her heart was so violently agitated that it required no other testimony to prove the truth of what had been told her. The princess threw herself at her mother's feet, and was received by the queen with open arms. After a silence of some moments, drying each other's tears with 1,000 kisses, they gave vent to their feelings in all those tender expressions which may be easily imagined on such an occasion. Then, turning to her nephew, the queen received him very favorably, and reiterated to him all the promises she had made to the necromancer. She would have said more, but a noise in the courtyard drawing her attention to the window, she had the agreeable surprise of seeing the queen her sister arrive. The prince and princess looking also, recognized near her the venerable Biroqua, and even the good Criquetin, who was also of the party. They, one and all, gave utterance to loud cries of joy. They hastened to embrace each other with inexpressible transport. The nuptials of the prince and the fair Babiola were celebrated immediately, in spite of the wicked Fanferluche, whose power and malice were thus equally confounded. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. The Three Bears. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Emily Lost. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. The Three Bears. A certain German forest near the Harz Mountains, there lived three exceedingly domestic bears. There was the father bear, the mother bear, and a little son. They had a nice little house, a chair each to sit on, a bed to sleep in, and a basin each for milk and honey, which was their favorite food. The fathers were the largest, the mothers a little smaller, and the little bears were the smallest of all. One day they boiled their milk and honey for breakfast, poured it into their basins, and went out for a walk while it cooled. Now it happened that very near the bears' little dwelling lived a woodman's little daughter all by herself. She was called Goldenhair. Her father and mother were both dead, so she was quite alone. She kept her small house very neat, made herself a bed of moss and beech leaves, and used to pick berries for her food. Of Of course the poor little thing had no one to teach her right from wrong, and she lived quite like a little savage in her forest home. Only she was a gentle creature, and used to sing like the birds in the trees under which she played. On the very morning that the three bears went for a walk, Goldenhair was also rambling about the wood. By and by she came to the bear's house, and as the window was open she peeped in. Seeing no one there, she shifted the latch and walked into the house. This was very rude of Goldenhair, but then she knew no better. She saw the three basins and looked into them, and then, taking up the tiny bear's, she tasted his milk and honey. She thought it very nice indeed, so she sat down in the little bear's chair to eat it, but the chair was much too small for her, and she broke the seat and fell through, basin and all. Now this was certainly stealing, but Goldenhair did not know that she ought not to take what was not her own. A tiny bear may only be a tiny bear, but still he has a right to his own things. Then Goldenhair went upstairs, and there she saw the three little beds all in a row. The first was the father bear's, the second was the mother bear's, and the last was Tiny Bear's. Goldenhair thought they looked very comfortable, and as she was a little tired, she got into the Tiny Bear's and fell asleep. By and by the bears came home. Tiny Bear looked at his chair and basin and said, "Somebody's been here." And Father Bear gruffly said, "Somebody has been here." And Mother Bear said, not quite so gruffly, "Somebody has been here." And then they went to the table and looked at their basins, and the Father Bear said gruffly, "Somebody has touched my basin." And Mother Bear said less gruffly, "Somebody has touched my basin." And Tiny Bear said in a high, shrill voice, "And somebody has broken mine." Then they all went upstairs and looked into their beds. "There is no one in my bed," said Father Bear gruffly. "There is nobody in my bed," said Mother Bear less gruffly. "There is a little girl in my bed," squeaked Tiny Bear, "and she has eaten up my breakfast and broken my chair and cracked my basin." The shrill voice of Tiny Bear woke up Goldenhair, and she startled out of the bed. The window was open, and she was so frightened that she jumped right out of it at once and ran away. And the bears went to the window and watched her, and saw her disappear into the forest. The Father Bear said gruffly, "The wolves will eat her." And Mother Bear said less gruffly, "The wolves will eat her." And Tiny Bear squeaked in his shrill voice, "The wolves will eat her." But they did not. Now, if you wish very much to know what became of Goldenhair, I will tell you. She ran terrified through the woods. She fell over the trunk of a tree, and while she lay on the ground, weeping, a bee buzzed up to her and said, "Little Goldenhair, what has happened?" "I went into the bear's house, beautiful bee, and ate up some milk and honey, and then I got into Tiny Bear's bed and fell asleep, and the bears came home and found me, and I was so frightened that I jumped out of the window, and I have just fallen down. If I had not jumped out, I dare say they would have killed me." "Very likely," buzzed the bee. "I dislike bears very much myself, and never cross their threshold. They eat our honey, they have no manners, and their figures are so very awkward, and their movements so uncouth. But you had no right to eat Tiny Bear's breakfast. That was stealing, and it was wrong. Never take a drop of honey from a flower without asking its leave first." Goldenhair sobbed out that she did not know that it was wrong. "Well," said the bee, "I don't see how you should, as you have not been taught. We bees have often pitied you. Now I am not rich, I am only an upholster bee, and I don't live in a hive, and I have no queen. But if you like to live with me and my little girl, I will do all that I can for you." Goldenhair was very glad to accept his kind offer, for she thought that honey was very nice, and she had no doubt that it would be her food if she lived with the upholsterer bee. Then the bee showed the child where she lived, in a hollow tree, and Goldenhair thought it was a very fine dwelling, for a bee had hung it all around with curtains cut from red poppy leaves, and it was so clean that you could have been delighted with it. "Now, Goldenhair," said the bee, "we cannot endure dirty children. Go and wash yourself in the stream, and wash your frock, and hang it out to dry." Goldenhair did what she was told, and when she was nicely dressed again in a clean white frock, and all her golden hair lay on her shoulders glistening in the sun, she looked very pretty indeed. She played all day with the butterflies and birds, and when the sun set she fell asleep. The next day the bee buzzed in her ear as soon as it was light, and woke her up. "Goldenhair," she said, as the child sat up and rubbed her sleepy blue eyes, "we can't have idle people here. I hate a drone. Get up and work." I have nothing to do," said Golden Hair. "I can't make honey." "But you can do a great many other things. Only wish I had your wonderful hands," said the bee. "What can I do?" asked Golden Hair. "I'll tell you. Get up and take a wooden spade and dig up the sweetest flowers in the wood and plant them here close to my cell, and when no rain comes, water them, and don't let the greedy worms eat them all up and pick them off the leaves." Golden Hair did as she was told, but not for very long, for a silly butterfly came and coaxed her to run a race with him, and laughed at her for grubbing in the mud and making her hands dirty. So she ran races and did not work. By and by she was hungry, and she said to the butterfly, "Will you give me some honey for dinner?" "I have not any honey," answered he. "You cannot expect a gentleman like me to provide food. It is quite beneath me. I eat a little bit of leaf here and there." "Oh my, I am so hungry," sobbed Golden Hair. "Absurd! How vulgar you are!" sang the butterfly, and he flew away, for, as he told the nearest rose, he hated to see tears, and the rose smiled at his wit and admired his fine feelings. Golden Hair went home and found her dinner ready, the purest honey, scented with lilac and wild thyme and honeysuckle. She ate a great deal of it, and thanked the bee. And the bee said, "You have not done much work. If I had been as idle as you are, I should have no dinner to give you." "It was all the butterfly's fault," said Golden Hair. "Nonsense," said the bee. "He could not make you idle unless you chose to be so. Don't tell me. One would get very little done if one could be persuaded to play at every idle insect one saw." "I will do better tomorrow," said Golden Hair. "Better begin today," answered the bee. "Who can tell if the sun will shine tomorrow?" So Golden Hair worked all afternoon, and when night came she felt happy and satisfied, as everybody does when they have done right. And a kind nightingale, who had been pleased to see her so industrious, came and sat on a bough close by, and sang her to sleep. The next day a robin woke her. "Get up," he said, "Golden Hair, the lark is singing hymns, and it's a pity you should not join in them. Besides, if you don't get up early, you will find no worms." "Thank you," said Golden Hair, "but I don't eat worms. I breakfast on honey." "That is very well for dessert," said Robin, "but for food I prefer something more substantial." "I should like a few cherries," sighed Golden Hair. "There are plenty of strawberries in the wood," said Robin. "If you will come with me, I will show you where they grow." And he showed Golden Hair a bed of ripe strawberries growing on a sunny bank, and they were quite delicious. "What a clever bird you are," said the child as she ate her breakfast with the robin, "and yet I should not have thought so, judging by your very plain suit, though, to be sure, your breast is a pretty color." "We must not judge by outside show," said Robin. "Neither I nor the bee are as gay as the butterfly, but I think I may say without boasting that we are worth a dozen of him." And Golden Hair thought so too. By and by the winter came, and snow fell fast, and the bitter wind blew through the trees. Golden Hair crouched down inside the old tree on the moss, and wept with the cold. "What a pity it is you have no feathers," said the robin. "Go to sleep," said the bee drowsily. "This is the sort of weather for a good nap." But Golden Hair could not sleep for the cold, and wishing would not give her feathers. By and by the robin said to Bee, "Golden Hair ought to go home to her own kind. I've had some crumbs to-day from such good people. I'm sure if they knew the child was here, they would help." "But how can we let them know?" said the bee. "You see, their education is so bad that they know nothing of our languages." "I will tell the dog," said Robin. "He is a great philanthropist, and can settle ways and means. I ought think he is much wiser than his master. A pheasant told me last autumn that the gentleman can do nothing without him." "Do speak to the dog," said the bee. "I don't like to see Golden Hair suffer, and do nothing for her." So the robin told the dog, and the dog said, "Show me where the child is." And Robin did so, and the dog barked and fawned on the little child, and Golden Hair was pleased, and stroked him, and nestled up to him, and warmed herself, and the dog lay closer beside her, and warmed her with his breath. And by he took some meat from his master's plate, and brought it to the hungry child. And the dog's master said to his wife, "I wonder where Tray goes every day with a piece of meat." And his wife said, "Why do you not follow him?" So the next day the gentleman went after his dog, and followed him through the wood till he came to a hollow tree, and there inside it, very pale and cold and miserable, lay a little child with golden hair, and the dog gave her the meat, while a solitary bee buzzing faintly near, and a robin twittered gratefully from a twig. The dog's master went in and took the poor babe in his arms and spoke to her, but Golden Hair had quite forgotten her own language, and knew only the dialects of the wood. But she wept, and clasped the gentleman's arm with beseeching hands. "Poor deserted babe," he said, embracing her, "I will take you home, and you shall be to me as a daughter." And the bee buzzed her contentment, and the robin sang a lay of rejoice, and the dog barked and frisked as if he were wild with delight. So Golden Hair was taken home by the dog's kind master, and he gave her to his wife and said, "I have found a wild child in the forest. Let her be our own." And the lady clasped the babe in her arms, and loved her from that day, and christened her Mary. And thus it happened that no one ever knew what had become of Golden Hair. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17. The Good Little Mouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The Old Fairy Tales by Laura Valentine. The Good Little Mouse. Once upon a time there lived a king and a queen whose mutual affection was so extreme that they formed each other's sole joy. Their sentiments and wishes were always in perfect unison. Sometimes they went hunting the hare or the stag, sometimes fishing for sole or carp, but always together. At balls they were always partners. At feasts they ate of the same dish, roast lamb with sugar plums. They frequently went to the theatre or the opera together. They sang duets and played a score of merry tricks for their mutual diversion at home. In a word, they were the happiest king and queen, and theirs was the happiest court on record. The subjects followed their sovereign's example, and vied with each other in light-heartedness and good humor. For all these reasons the kingdom was called Happyland. At the same time there happened to be a neighboring state, a king of quite an opposite character. He was the declared enemy of pleasure, and thought the more grief the better sport. His looks were sullen, his eyes were hollow, his beard was long and grizzly, his body was thin, his complexion sallow, and his hair black, thick, and as rough as a bear's. This ferocious monarch would amuse himself by shooting at his subjects. He was himself the executioner of criminals, and delighted only in cruel and wicked deeds. When he heard of a kind mother who was very fond of a good little boy or girl, he summoned them to his presence, and either strangled the child or broke its arm before its mother's face. His kingdom was called Tearland. This wicked king, having heard of the happiness of the good King Felix, became so jealous of his neighbor's joy that he resolved to raise a large army and lay waste to his dominions. When everything was ready, the bad king, Constantine, advanced towards Happyland. The news of his coming was not long in reaching the ears of King Felix. He therefore promptly put his kingdom in a state of defense. Queen Felicia was in an agony of fear, and said to her husband with tears in her eyes, "Sir, let us take as much money as we can carry, and fly to any place on earth from the threatened danger." "For shame, madame," answered Felix. "My duty is to protect my people, and it bids me prefer a glorious death to a life of shame." He then tenderly kissed his queen, and having assembled and inspected his army, mounted a noble charger and set out to meet the enemy. Felicia, left alone, gave way to the most trending tears and lamentations, and, wringing her hands, "Alas, alas!" said she, "what will become of me should Felix be slain in battle? A widow and a captive, the wicked king will never spare me in his wrath." These sorrowful thoughts prevented her eating and sleeping. The king wrote to her daily from the camp, and one morning, as she was anxiously watching the arrival of the courier from the city walls, she saw him approaching the city at full gallop. She hastened to meet him, fearful of some great misfortune, crying out, "Ho, courier, ho! Courier, what news do you bring?" "The battle is lost," said the messenger. "The king is killed, and the wicked Constantine is on the road hither." The poor queen fainted away, and was carried to bed insensible, where all her ladies in tears surrounded her, some mourning for the loss of a father, others for sons or brothers. There was weeping and wailing and tearing of hair. Soon the bad king was heard approaching. Heading his unprincipled subjects, he entered the city, sword in hand, and slew without mercy all whom he encountered. The inhabitants fled before him with loud cries, and all who escaped took refuge in the country. With his sword still reeking, the king entered the palace and ascended to the queen's apartment. When she beheld him in the room, she buried herself under the bedclothes, terrified to the last degree. He strode up to the bed, pulled off the clothes, tore the queen's cap from her head, and scattered her long ringlets over her shoulders. Then, gathering them in his hand, he dragged her 3 times round the room, and threw her over his shoulders as if she had been a sack of corn, and in this manner carried her off. Felicia entreated him for mercy, but in vain; he only laughed at her supplications. The king carried Felicia to his own country, swearing all the way that he was determined to hang her, but, on second thought, he determined to spare her life for the present, and if she had a daughter to marry the latter to his son. Anxious to know if she would have a daughter, he sent for a fairy, who lived at no great distance from his palace. When she arrived, he entertained the fairy better than was his usual custom, and conducted her to the tower, in the upper part of which, in a small and miserably furnished garret, the poor queen was confined. There was no bed, but a wretched worn-out old mattress only, not worth 2d, on which the desolate Felicia sat and wept day and night. When the fairy saw her, her heart melted with pity. She courtesied to the queen, and whispered in her ear as she embraced her, "Do not despair, madame. Your misfortunes will not last forever, and I hope to contribute to their speedy termination." Queen Felicia, somewhat comforted by these words, returned the fairy's embrace, and begged her to take pity on a poor princess who had never designedly injured any one, but had always endeavoured to do all the good in her power. They were conversing together when the wicked king interrupted them with, "Come, not so many compliments. I brought you hither to tell me whether this slave will have a son or a daughter." The fairy answered, "She will have a daughter who will be the fairest and most charming princess ever seen." With that the fairy endowed the princess yet to be born with innumerable virtues and accomplishments. "If she prove not fair and amiable," said the wicked king, "I will tie her to her mother's neck and hang them to the branch of a tree, nor shall tears nor entreaties induce me to relent." He then quitted the garret, accompanied by the fairy, without bestowing a look upon the good queen, who was weeping bitterly and saying to herself, "Alas! what will become of me? Should I have a pretty little daughter, he will give her to his monster son. Should she be ugly, he will hang us both. To what a miserable extremity am I reduced!" She had no friend to whom she could confide her trouble, or who might console her. Her jailer gave her daily 3 parched peas only, with a small allowance of water, and sometimes a very small piece of black bread. She soon therefore became thinner than a herring, and reduced to mere skin and bone. As she was spinning one evening, for the wicked king, who was very covetous, made her work day and night, she saw a very pretty little mouse creep through a hole into her room. "Alas, my darling," said the wretched Felicia, "there is nothing here for you. 3 peas a day are my allowance, so if you would not fast, go elsewhere for food." The little mouse ran to and fro, dancing and skipping so gaily that the queen took much pleasure in watching its antics, and was induced to give it the only pea she had left for her supper. "Here, pretty one," she said, "eat this. It is all I have to offer you, but I give it willingly." The words had scarcely passed her lips when she saw on her table a fine plump partridge, admirably dressed with bread sauce and 2 boxes of bonbons. "In truth," said Felicia, "a kind action always brings its reward." With that she ate a little, but having fasted so long she was almost past eating. She threw a sweetmeat to the mouse, who soon began to nibble it, and when he had done his supper, danced still more prettily than before. The next morning, when the jailer brought the queen's 3 peas, which he carried in on a large dish with a cover, by way of ridicule, the little mouse crept softly to the dish and munched them all 3, together with the morsel of bread. When it was dinner time, and the queen found the dish empty, she was somewhat angry with the mouse. "This greedy little creature," said the hungry Felicia, "if it serve me so to-morrow, I shall pine to death." She was about to put the cover over the empty dish, when she found all kinds of nice things in it, and rejoicing at this unexpected discovery, quickly began to eat. But while she was eating, it came to her mind that the wicked king would perhaps in a few days put her and her child to death, and she ceased eating to indulge her tears. Then, raising her eyes to heaven, she exclaimed, "What! and is there no means of escape?" As she spoke she observed her little friend playing with 2 or 3 long straws. Felicia took them from the mouse and began to plait them. "If I had enough," said she, "I would make a covered basket large enough to hold my little daughter, and give her through the window to the first charitable person who would take charge of her." She set to work with a good heart, while the good little mouse took care that she did not want for straw, continuing to drag it into the garret as fast as Felicia could use it, and dancing and skipping for her amusement. At meal times the queen gave her 3 peas to the mouse, and received in exchange a good supply of delicious food. Felicia was extremely puzzled to imagine who it could be that sent her so many nice things. As she was one day looking out of the window to try the length of her straw plait, she observed at the foot of the tower a good little woman leaning on a staff, who, directly she saw the queen's face, said to her, "I am acquainted with your grief, madam, and I am willing to assist you." "Alas, my dear friend," answered the queen, "you will do me a great favour. Come every evening under my window, and when my child is born I will lower the dear baby to you, nurse it, and bring it up for me, and when I am able I will amply reward you." "I am not covetous," answered the old woman, "but am somewhat dainty, and there is nothing pleases my palate better than a nice, fat, plump mouse. If you can catch any such in your garret, kill them and throw them to me. I am not ungrateful, and your infant will fare all the better for your kindness." When Queen Felicia heard this speech she began to cry, and the old woman, after waiting her answer for a few minutes, asked her the cause of her tears. "I grieve," said the poor queen, "because there is only one mouse which comes to my chamber, and it is so pretty and so good that I cannot put it to death." "What!" answered the old woman in a passion, "could you sacrifice your child for love for a little rogue of a mouse, who nibbles all that falls in his way? Very well, madam, please yourself, and I wish you very much joy with your companion. I shall not want for mice without your assistance." With that the old woman went her way, grumbling and muttering between her teeth. Although the queen had a nice meal on her table, and although the good little mouse came as usual to skip and dance for her amusement, she kept her eyes riveted on the floor, her heart beating violently, while tears coursed each other down her cheeks. That very night she became the mother of a little girl, a miracle of beauty, which instead of crying like other children, smiled in her face, holding out her tiny hands as if she had been very rational. The queen caressed and kissed the little stranger very tenderly, saying to herself, "Alas, my poor little darling, if you fall into the wicked king's clutches, it will be all up with you." She then placed her gently in the basket and pinned to her clothes a scrap of paper on which was written, "This unfortunate little girl's name is Ametta." In a minute or two she opened the basket again, and though her infant looked prettier than ever, she kissed her again and burst into tears. At this moment the good little mouse skipped into the room and crept into the basket with Ametta. "Ah, little creature," said Felicia, "how dearly I have purchased your life! Perhaps I shall lose my dear Ametta. Who but I would have scrupled to kill you for the dainty old woman's dinner? Well, I could not find it in my heart to do so cruel a deed." The good little mouse answered the queen in these words: "Do not regret your kindness, madam. I am not quite so unworthy of it as you may imagine." Fear and astonishment struggled in the queen's breast when she heard the little mouse speak, and her fear not a little increased when she observed its little snout take the form of a face, with its little paws become hands and feet, and all at once its whole body increase in size. At last the queen recognized in the now entirely metamorphosed mouse the fairy who had visited her in company with the wicked king, and who had manifested so much affection for her. The fairy spoke: "I have tried your heart, and I find that it is good and generous. We fairies, although possessed of wealth and power, seek, as the greatest treasure upon earth, true friendship, and rarely do we find it." "Is it possible, fair lady," said the queen, embracing her, "that you, rich and powerful as you are, have any difficulty to find friends?" "Yes," answered the fairy, "we are loved but for interest, and that is not the kind of love we care for; but when loved as you loved me as a little mouse, no service is too great to show our affection. Anxious to put your goodness to the test, I assumed the figure of an old woman, and accosted you from the foot of the tower. You know that your heart was proof against the trial." Thereupon the fairy embraced the queen, and having tenderly kissed the little princess 3 times, she said, "I endow you, sweet child, to be the comfort of your mother, and richer than your father, to reach the age of 100 years, with undiminished beauty, free from illness, wrinkles, or other appearance of age." The queen in raptures thanked the beneficent fairy, and entreated her to remove Amietta from the prison, and take care of her, adding that she give her child freely to be the fairy's daughter. The fairy accepted the present, and thanked Queen Felicia. She placed the baby gently in the basket, and lowered it through the window, but having waited a few moments to resume the shape of the little mouse, when she descended by the straw plait, the baby was no longer there. She returned hastily to the queen. "All is lost," she said. "My enemy Caucaline has just carried off the princess. You must know she is a cruel fairy who mortally hates me, and being unfortunately my senior, is more powerful than myself. I know not how I can contrive to withdraw Amietta from her vile clutches." When the queen heard this sad intelligence her grief was excessive. Weeping very bitterly, she conjured her kind friend to endeavour to recover her darling Amietta at all hazards. Meanwhile the jailer, coming to pay his daily visit to the queen, knew that she had become a mother, and hastened to inform the wicked king, who went straightway to demand the child. Felicia said that a fairy, whose name she did not know, had taken it from her by force. On hearing this the wicked king stamped his feet and gnawed his very finger nails with rage. "I promised," said he, "to hang you, nor will I delay to keep my word." With that he seized the poor queen by the hair of her head, dragged her into a wood, climbed a tall tree, and was on the point of hanging her, when the fairy, having rendered herself invisible, came close beside him and pushed him down to the ground, dislocating his nose and breaking 4 teeth in the fall. The fairy then hastened away with the queen in her flying chariot, and conducted her to a noble castle, where Felicia was carefully nursed, and for the loss of her little Amietta, would have been completely happy. Time slipped away, and the queen's excessive affliction gradually diminished. 15 years had passed since the birth of her daughter, when she heard that the wicked king's son had offered his hand to a young girl who kept his father's turkeys, but that she had refused him. It was not a little surprising that a turkey keeper should refuse to become a princess, with a reasonable prospect of being one day queen. The nuptial dresses, too, were prepared, and it was to have been so gay a wedding that guests had come to witness it from 300 miles round. The good little mouse was among these guests, and wishing to see the turkey keeper at her ease, paid her a visit in the poultry yard. She found the turkey keeper seated on a large stone, dressed in a coarse stuff petticoat, with neither shoe nor stocking on her feet. Dresses of gold and silver brocade, trimmed with diamonds, pearls, ribbons, and the finest lace, were lying near her, trodden under the turkey's feet, covered with dirt and completely spoiled. Presently the wicked king's son, who was lame, humpbacked, and blind of one eye, approached her, and said rudely, "If you still refuse to have me, I will be the death of you." The turkey keeper answered hotly, "I can never love nor consent to marry you. You are too ugly, and too much like your cruel father. Leave me in peace with my turkeys. I love them better than all your finery." The good little mouse gazed on her with admiration, for she was as beautiful as the moon. When the wicked king's son was out of sight, the fairy assumed the figure of an old shepherdess, and, accosting the rustic beauty, said: "Good morrow, daughter. You have a fine flock of fat turkeys here." The young turkey keeper smiled sweetly on the old dame, and said: "They are trying to persuade me to abandon them for a weary crown. Pray assist me with your advice." "Daughter," said the fairy, "a crown is not to be despised. You neither know its value nor importance." "So well do I know both the one and the other," answered the turkey keeper promptly, "that I am resolved never to share one with an unworthy person. Yet I do not know who I am, nor who are my father and mother. I have neither relations nor friends." "You have beauty and virtue, my child," said the wise fairy, "which are more valuable than 10 kingdoms. Tell me, I entreat you, who placed you here, since you have neither father, mother, relations, or friends?" "A fairy," answered the fair turkey feeder, "named Caucaline, is the cause of me being in this place. She brought me up from infancy, but treated me so cruelly that one day I resolved to escape from her house, and, after wandering for some time, was resting in a wood, when the wicked king's son happened to pass that way. He saw me and asked if I would take care of his poultry. I accepted his offer, and his turkeys were immediately placed under my charge. He came from time to time to see how they thrived, and of course saw me also, when, alas! without the slightest desire on my part for the honour, he fell so desperately in love that I am teased out of my life by his importunities." When the fairy had heard this artless tale, she began to think that the turkey keeper must be the Princess Amietta. "What is your name, my dear?" she said. "I am called Amietta," answered the rustic. On hearing this the fairy could no longer doubt the truth of her surmises, so throwing her arm round the princess's neck, she almost devoured her with caresses, and said: "Amietta, I have known you from your birth, and am very glad to find you so pretty and so prudent, but I shall like to see you better dressed. As your present appearance is anything but favourable, let me see how you look in these fine clothes." Amietta, who was very obedient, immediately complied with the fairy's request. She uncovered her head, when immediately her long hair, which was finer than gossamer, and of the most delicate auburn, fell to the ground in graceful curls. Then, taking in the palms of her delicate hands some water from a clear stream that ran near the henhouse, she bathed her face, when her complexion became clear as oriental pearl. Roses seemed to blow upon her cheeks and carnations on her lips. Her mild breath was as sweet as the honeysuckle or wild thyme. Her form was graceful as the fawn's, while the whiteness of her bosom surpassed that of drifted snow, or lily of the valley. When she was dressed, the fairy declared her a miracle of beauty, and said: "Who now do you think you are, my dear Amietta?" "In truth," answered the princess, "I cannot help fancying myself the daughter of some great king." "Should you be very glad if it were so?" asked the fairy. "Yes, my dear madam," answered Amietta, courtesying, "I should be very, very glad." "Very well," said the fairy. "Be happy then. I will tell you more to morrow." Thereupon the fairy departed, and returned in all diligence to her fine castle, where Queen Felicia was employed spinning silk. "Will it please you, your Majesty," cried the good little mouse, "to wager your spindle and your distaff that I do not bring you the best news you have ever heard?" "Alas!" answered the queen, "since the death of King Felix and the loss of my darling Ametta, all the news in the world is nothing to me." "A truce to your sorrow," said the fairy. "The princess whom I have just seen is quite well, and so exceedingly beautiful that it will be her own fault if she do not become a queen." The good fairy then related all she had learned, and the queen shed tears of joy to hear that her daughter was still alive and so beautiful, but was overwhelmed with the sorrow to learn that she was a turkey keeper. "When my dear husband and myself were a powerful king and queen, and in the height of our prosperity, we little thought a child of ours would ever be a turkey keeper." "Never mind," said the fairy, "it is a trick of the wicked Caucaline, who, aware of my affection for you, has reduced Ametta to this condition; but I will be equal with my rival yet, and will either restore the princess to her proper rank or burn my books." "I have no ambition to see my child married to the wicked king's son," said the queen, "so do not delay to bring her hither." In the meantime the wicked king's son, repulsed by Ametta in the presence of the good little mouse, was very much enraged against her, and seating himself under the palace wall he began to cry so loudly that the wicked king overheard him. Throwing up the window and putting out his head, "What is the matter? What are you making all this noise about?" said he. "Our turkey keeper loves me not," answered the son. "How, loves you not?" said the wicked king. "But I say she shall love you." With that he called his guards, and gave orders for them to bring the turkey keeper to his presence, adding that he would make her bitterly repent her obstinacy in refusing to love his handsome son. The guards, in obedience to the orders they had received, went immediately to the turkey yard, when they found Ametta attired in a superb robe of white satin, embroidered with diamonds and rubies, and tastefully trimmed with ribbon. Never in their lives had they seen so noble looking and beautiful a lady, and believing her to be a princess, they were afraid to speak. "Pray tell me whom you seek," said Ametta, in a very sweet and amiable voice. "Madam," they answered, "we come, by the king's orders, in search of a wretched young woman named Ametta." "Alas!" answered the princess, "that is my name. What would you with me?" They dared not hesitate to seize her, so, binding her hands and feet with strong cords, they dragged her before the wicked king and his son. When the king saw how very beautiful she was, in spite of himself, he was a little moved. Indeed, she must have excited the kindest feelings in his bosom if he had not been the most wicked person in the world. When he had surveyed her from head to foot, he said, "So, madam, I hear that you will not consent to marry my son. He is 100 times too good for you, and, fine as you think yourself, one of his looks is worth more than all of your charms. Come, marry him immediately, or I will have you flayed alive." The princess, trembling like a dove in the net of the fowler, threw herself at his feet, and embracing his knees, said, "Sire, I conjure you to have pity on me. To injure an unprotected girl would be unworthy of your royal dignity. Give me a day or two to reflect, and I will then no longer oppose your wishes." The son, furious at her for not consenting on the spot, would have had her flayed at once, but the king finally resolved to place her in confinement, and she was conducted to a high tower, where she was deprived of the light of the sun. At this crisis the good fairy and the queen arrived in the flying chariot, and soon learned all that had taken place. The queen began to weep bitterly, saying that her misfortunes were interminable, but that she would rather see her daughter dead than married to the wicked king's son. "Be of good cheer," said the fairy. "I am about to annoy them that you shall be amply avenged." When the wicked king went to bed, the beneficent fairy, having assumed the shape of a mouse, concealed herself under the bolster of his bed, and just as he was falling asleep crept out and gnawed his ear. Muttering an oath, he turned around in bed when the little mouse gnawed his other ear. The king flew into a passion, and called aloud for help. The attendants entered the room, and found the king with both his ears so severely bitten, and bleeding so fast, that all their efforts to staunch the wounds were unavailing. While a diligent search was making for the mouse, she paid the wicked king's son a visit, served him in the same manner. He was soon heard bawling for assistance, and when the servants came into his apartment, they beheld him with his ears nearly skinned. The surgeon was sent for, and the good little mouse returned to the wicked king's bedchamber, when she found the king again dozing off to sleep. She now crept up to his nose, and began to nibble with all her might, and when the king covered that with his hands, she applied herself industriously to bite and scratch them also. "Help! help!" cried the king, "I am suffering martyrdom!" And while he was shouting, the little mouse crept into his mouth and nibbled his tongue, lips, and cheeks. The attendants rushed into the room, and found the king looking ghastly and almost speechless, from the effects of the mouse's little teeth on his tongue. All he could do was to make signs that a mouse was the author of this new mischief, when the mattress, the bolster, and every hole and corner of the room were again searched in vain, for the mouse was off a second time to the sun, whom she completely blinded, for she gnawed his remaining eye; he was already blind of one. In a transport of fury, with his drawn sword in hand, he blundered into his father's room, whom he found storming and swearing that he would destroy everything an inch high and an hour old, if the mouse were not found. When the king saw his son, he stormed also at him, and the latter, whose ears were bound up, not recognizing his father's voice, immediately attacked him. The wicked king, amazed, thrust his sword through the body of his son, and stumbled in his eagerness on his adversary's weapon, which impaled him, and thus father and son rolled on the floor dead at each other's hands. Their subjects, who hated them mortally, and only obeyed them out of fear, no longer dreading their anger, tied cords to their feet and dragged them into the river, saying that they were very glad to be rid of them so easily. Thus died the wicked king of Tearland, and his equally wicked son. The beneficent fairy hastened to inform the queen of the event, and they went together to the Black Tower, in which Amietta was confined under more than 40 locks. The fairy struck the outer door 3 times with her little nut-tree wand, when it immediately flew open, as did all the others, and they found the poor princess in the deepest affliction. Throwing herself on her daughter's neck, My long-lost darling," said the queen, "I am your unfortunate mother, Queen Felicia." Thereupon she communicated to the princess every particular of her history, at which Amietta was so transported with joy that it almost cost her her life. She threw herself at the queen's feet, embraced them, bathed them with her tears, and kissed them again and again. She then tenderly embraced the fairy, who had brought her basketfuls full of jewels of enormous value, with gold, diamonds, bracelets, pearls, and the portrait of King Felix, set in jewels, which she held up for her inspection. "But we have no time to lose," said she. "Now is the time for a master stroke. Let us go to the large hall of the palace and harangue the people." The fairy led the way with a very sedate and serious countenance, wearing a robe with a train more than 6 ells long. The queen's dress was of blue velvet, covered with gold embroidery, and had still a longer train. In order to make this display they had brought their richest suits with them. They wore, likewise, crowns on their heads, which sparkled like so many suns. The Princess Amietta followed her mother, looking as modest as Diana, and as beautiful as Venus. They curtsied to all whom they met, gentle or simple. A crowd soon collected about them, anxious to learn who these fair and noble-looking ladies could be. They entered the large hall in which the court was usually held, and when it was as full as it could hold, the beneficent fairy told the people that she proposed to give them for their queen the daughter of King Felix of Happy Land, whom she then introduced to their notice, adding that they would certainly be contented with her government, and that if they accepted her for their sovereign, she, the fairy, would find Amietta a husband as perfect as herself, and would restore cheerfulness to the kingdom, and forever banish melancholy from their hearts. When these words were heard, loud shouts of "Long live Amietta, Queen of Tearland, now Happy Land," resounded from the multitude, and almost split the roof. At the same moment 100 different musical instruments struck up a lively waltz, and the people joined hands and began to dance round the queen, her daughter, and the benignant fairy, singing with one voice: "All hail to our queen, who brings brightness and joy To the hearts of a people by care long oppressed. Long, long may she live, while each thought we employ To render her happy by whom we are blessed. A wiser or better earth never has seen. Then live Amietta, long, long live the queen." Thus kindly they were welcomed, and never until the time in which we live was there a queen more beloved. At her coronation, which, as may be expected, was magnificent in the extreme, tables were spread in the park, collations were served, all present ate, drank, and were merry, and then retired to rest, blessing their youthful queen. Shortly afterward the fairy presented to the gentle Amietta the most handsome prince that eyes ever looked upon, and what is more, as good as he was handsome. The fairy, who had to seek such a paragon of a husband in a very remote kingdom, brought him in her flying chariot, and so well were they matched that directly they met, they conceived the most tender and lasting attachment for each other. Magnificent preparations were made for the wedding, and the ceremony was performed with the utmost splendor, and followed by rejoicings which lasted 6 months throughout the kingdom. End of chapter 17. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, B.C.